Hey there, and welcome back. If you're settling in right now, maybe pulling a blanket up a little higher, maybe letting your shoulders drop for the first time since this morning, good. Because tonight's story is the kind that asks very little of you. It only asks that you be still, that the room around you be quiet, and that you let your mind drift backward through about 200 years of evenings until it lands somewhere very specific. A house, a street, a particular kind of light. Tonight, we are going to a townhouse in London in the 1810s, Regency England, the years when George III had retired from public life into illness and his eldest son, the Prince Regent, was governing in his place. The years when Jane Austen was finishing the last of her novels, and Walter Scott was writing the books that would make him famous, and Lord Byron was waking up one morning to find himself, as he put it, the literary lion of the season. The years just after the long war with France had ended at Waterloo, and just before the railways changed the country forever. A small, narrow window of British history that has, for reasons we will get to, embedded itself in the popular imagination far more deeply than its actual length would suggest. But we are not going to look at battles or politics or the famous personalities of the period tonight. We are going to do something quieter. We are going to spend an evening inside an ordinary Regency townhouse, a merchant's family perhaps, or a barrister's. Comfortable but not titled. Educated but not aristocratic. The sort of household that fills the squares of Bloomsbury and the streets of Marylebone and the new terraces going up north of Oxford Street and west toward Hyde Park. The sort of family whose name you would not find in any history book, but whose evenings in their thousands and thousands of small ordinary repetitions made up the actual texture of life in that decade. Picture this for a moment. It is somewhere around 5 o'clock on a November afternoon in 1814. The light has already gone from the sky. London at this latitude in November loses the sun before 4, and by 5 it is properly, completely dark. There is fog, because there is almost always fog in November London, and the fog is thickened by the smoke of 500,000 coal fires now being lit or stoked across the city as the temperature drops. The streets are dim. Lamplighters are moving along the pavements with their long poles, lifting the glass cover of each oil lamp in turn, dipping in their wick, and lighting the small flame inside. They will do this several thousand times tonight across the West End and the city. By 6, the streets will be threaded with little points of yellow light, soft and unsteady, doing what they can against the November dark. And it is in front of one of these houses, on a quiet street somewhere off Russell Square, that you have just stepped down from a carriage. The door is being opened for you. A footman stands aside to let you pass. Behind you, the cold and the fog and the dim lamplit street. In front of you, the soft yellow warmth of a lit hall, the smell of beeswax and coal smoke and something cooking somewhere far below, the sound of a clock ticking in the depths of the house. You are being welcomed in. The household has been expecting you. You step over the threshold, and the door closes behind you, and the November evening is, for the next several hours, somewhere else. Inside, the day is also turning. The master of the household has come home from his chambers about an hour ago. His coat is hanging on a peg in the hall. He has gone upstairs to change, because one does not sit at dinner in the same clothes in which one has conducted business. The mistress has been in the drawing room for some time now, with one of her older daughters and a quantity of needlework. 2 younger children have been brought down briefly by the nurse, kissed, admired, and then taken back upstairs to the nursery for their supper. A footman is laying the table in the dining room behind closed doors. The cook below stairs is at the most demanding hour of her day, the hour just before dinner is served, when several different dishes need to come together at the same moment, and none of them can be allowed to spoil. There is a smell of roasting meat coming up the back stairs, faintly, mixed with the smell of coal smoke and tallow candle, and the polish on the floorboards. This is the moment we are going to inhabit together for the next several hours, the transition from day into night in a Regency household. The long, slow, candle-lit wind down that ended every middle-class evening in this period. And that, for the people living through it, was just simply the way evenings worked. We are going to look at the rooms. And here is what I want you to understand before we go any further, because it is going to shape everything else we look at tonight. The Regency evening was not primarily about activity. It was not about productivity. It was about presence. It was about being in the same room as your family, doing things together, even when those things were small and quiet and would never be remembered by history. Reading aloud while someone else sewed, playing cards by candlelight, drinking tea from cups that had to be poured by hand from a pot that had been brought up from a kitchen by a maid who had carried hot water up 2 flights of stairs, sitting and listening while one of the daughters of the house played a piece on the pianoforte that she had been practicing for a week in front of the people who knew her best in the world. That is the texture of the evening we are going to enter. And I think it is worth saying right at the start that this texture is not entirely available to us anymore. We can recreate the rooms. We can light the candles. We can play the music. But the particular way that an entire household, including its children and its servants and its visiting friends, organized itself around the fact that there was nothing else competing for its attention, no screen, no notification, no other place anyone needed to be, that is something we have to work to imagine. And that is, in a way, what this whole episode is about, imagining it carefully, sitting with it, letting it slow your own thinking down for a while. So let me tell you a few things about Regency London first, just to fix the world we are entering. The London of 1814 was a city of about 1.25 million people. It was, by some distance, the largest city in Europe, larger than Paris, larger than any other British city by a factor of nearly 10. It was growing fast. New squares and terraces were being thrown up to the north and west of the older medieval core, on land that had been farmland or open ground only a generation earlier. The city we know as the West End, with its grand stuccoed terraces and its Regent Street and its Regent's Park, was being designed and built during exactly this period, much of it under the direction of the architect John Nash, whose work would shape the shape of central London for 200 years. But our family does not live in one of Nash's grand new terraces. Those were for the very rich. Our family lives in something more modest, a 4-story brick townhouse in a row of similar townhouses, all built in the previous 20 or 30 years to a fairly standard plan. 3 windows wide on each floor, a front door painted in some practical colour, a fan light above the door, iron railings out front, an area below pavement level for the servants to come and go without being seen from the street, the kitchens and the storage rooms in the basement, a dining room and morning room on the ground floor, a drawing room, sometimes called the front parlour, on the first floor up with the largest and best windows of the house, bedrooms on the second floor, servants' rooms and a nursery in the attic under the slope of the roof. This standard plan, repeated thousands of times across the squares and terraces of London, gave the city a particular rhythm of life that is worth noticing. Everyone lived vertically. The kitchen was always below you. The bedroom was always above you. The drawing room was always the floor between, raised a flight up from the street to give it light, and to give it some distance from the noise and dust of the carriages outside. To move from one part of your evening to another was to move up or down a staircase, from dinner in the dining room downstairs, up to the drawing room, from the drawing room, when the night ended, up again to the bedroom. The staircase was the spine of the house, and you climbed it, candlestick in hand, several times a day. The candlestick in your hand at the end of the evening, by the way, was a specific object with a specific name. It was called a chamberstick. It was a flat, wide-based candle holder with a short handle, designed to be carried from the drawing room or the dining room up to the bedroom, the chamber, at the end of the night. There would be a little supply of these on a side table near the foot of the stairs, with a snuffer and a tinder box ready for use. Every member of the family took their own up to bed. Every guest staying the night was given one. phrase to take one's chamberstick passed into the language of the period as a way of saying that the evening had ended, that one was retiring, that the social part of the day was over. It is a phrase we no longer have any use for, because we no longer take a small flame upstairs with us into the dark. But for almost the entire history of European civilization, up until the introduction of household gas lighting in the 1840s and electric lighting in the 1880s, the chamberstick or its equivalent was simply how you got to bed. You did not flip a switch at the door of your room. You carried your light with you, and you guarded it carefully against drafts. And when it went out, the dark was complete. I think about that small object a great deal. The chamberstick, the personal flame, the way it required you to walk slowly because moving quickly would put it out, the way it forced you as you climbed the stairs to be aware of just how dark the rest of the house was around the small island of light you carried. There was no overhead light spilling down from anywhere. There was no glow from another room. There was just you, and the few feet of staircase your candle illuminated, and the dark beyond. And then you arrived at your bedroom, and the cold of the room, because no fire had been lit in there yet, and the small flame on the chest of drawers as you set the chamberstick down and started to undress. I am getting ahead of myself. We are not at bedtime yet. We are, in our story, just at the moment when the family is sitting down to dinner. The bedtime hours are several hours away still, but I wanted to introduce you to that small object early, because everything else we are going to look at tonight, every room enter, every activity we are going to consider, was lit by candles. And the limits of what a candle can light, the small radius of effective illumination, the way it flickers, the way it casts shadows that are deeper and darker than anything we are used to, the way it must constantly be tended and replaced and trimmed and snuffed. This shaped the entire emotional quality of the Regency evening in ways that I think we tend to underestimate. We are about to walk into a house lit entirely by living flame, hundreds of small fires, in a sense, distributed across half a dozen rooms. Beeswax candles in the drawing room, where the family sits. Tallow candles in the kitchen and the servants' rooms, because beeswax is expensive, and tallow burns dirty but burns cheap. An argand oil lamp on the side table, perhaps, if the household is up to date with the latest in domestic illumination. A coal fire in the drawing room grate, throwing additional light. Another in the dining room, a smaller one already lit in the master and mistress's bedroom by a maid, so that the room would not be cold when they came up. All of this firelight, all of this oil and wax burning at once, gave the Regency interior a quality that no electric room can quite recreate. Warm, unsteady, smelling faintly of beeswax and coal smoke and the food that had been served at dinner an hour or two before. Rooms that did not have flat, even illumination, but pools of light around the fire and around the candle stands, with corners that fell into genuine darkness, with faces that moved in and out of view as the flames moved. And in the middle of it, the family, sitting and reading, sitting and sewing, sitting and playing cards, sitting and listening, doing all of the small, unmemorable things that repeated hundreds of times across a lifetime, made up what we now call domestic life in this particular sliver of the past. So get comfortable. We have a long evening ahead of us. We are going to look at the house itself in a moment, the bricks and the rooms and the way the family used them. We are going to look at the strange and beautiful ritual of taking tea, which by this period had become one of the most important social events of the Regency day. We are going to sit at the dinner table and watch the courses come up from the kitchen on platters carried by footmen. We are going to follow the women into the drawing room when they withdraw, and we are going to follow the men back in when they rejoin them. We are going to listen to a daughter play the pianoforte. We are going to look at the cards on the table during a hand of whist. We are going to go down below stairs and see what the cook and the housemaids and the footmen are doing, while all of this gentility is happening above their heads. And finally, we are going to follow the family up to bed, watching each of them take their chamberstick from the table at the foot of the stairs and climb up into the dark, room by room, candle by candle, until the whole house is asleep. That is the journey. It will take us a while, and that is the point. There is no rush tonight. The Regency household was not in a rush either. They had nowhere to be. The night was long, the dark was complete, and the people they cared about most in the world were in the next chair over. Let me start with the house. To stand on a London street in 1814 and look at a row of new townhouses was to look at one of the most successful pieces of domestic architecture ever produced anywhere. The Georgian terrace, by the time it reached its Regency maturity, had been refined over more than a century into something close to perfection for its purpose. The bricks were yellow stock, the kind made from the clay of the Thames Valley, fired in kilns to a soft butterscotch colour that aged gracefully in London's smoky air to a darker, soutier brown. The doors were 6-panel, painted in a small range of acceptable colours: black, dark green, occasionally a deep red. The fanlight above the door was a small semicircle of glass, set into a delicate fan-shaped iron frame, designed to admit light into the entrance hall without compromising the privacy of the family inside. The windows were large, multi-paned, sash type, designed to slide up and down and to let in the maximum possible quantity of London's grudging daylight. What you could not see from the street was that all of these houses were built to a remarkably similar internal plan. There was almost a national template by this point. The hall just inside the front door, narrow and straight, leading back to the staircase. To the left or right of the hall, a front room used either as a morning room, where the mistress of the house dealt with correspondence and the day's small business in the morning hours, or sometimes as a small dining room for everyday meals. Behind that front room, a larger back room, often the formal dining room, with windows overlooking the small garden or yard at the rear of the property. Up the staircase to the first floor, the drawing room, occupying often the entire frontage of the house, with 3 windows looking out over the street. Sometimes there was a back drawing room as well, smaller, used for music or quieter activities, separated from the front drawing room by folding doors that could be opened up when the family entertained. Up another flight, the bedrooms. The master bedroom and the mistress's bedroom often connected to each other through a small dressing room. Other bedrooms for older children or for guests. Another staircase, narrower and steeper this time, leading up to the attic floor where the servants slept and where the nursery was located. Below the ground floor, accessible through a separate door reached by descending the steps from the street into the area, the basement. The kitchen, the scullery, the larder, the servants' hall where the staff ate their meals, the cellar where coal and wine were kept, a whole separate domain of the house, much busier than the upstairs at most hours of the day, in which the actual physical work of running the household happened. There is something I find genuinely worth pausing on in this design. The household was vertical. The family lived in the middle. Above them, their children slept, and their servants slept. Below them, their servants worked. The whole house hummed at all hours with the activity of people preparing food, polishing silver, beating carpets, fetching coal, hauling water, and the principal rooms in which the family conducted their leisure, the drawing room above all, was sandwiched between the labour below and the labour above, while looking out over a quiet street where, after dark, almost nothing moved at all. The front door of our chosen house on the November evening we are visiting is closed. The brass knocker has not been touched in some hours. The shutters are drawn on the ground floor windows, and curtains have been pulled across the first floor drawing room windows where the family will spend most of their evening. From outside, the house presents a calm and slightly opaque face to the street. A single candle burning in the entrance hall, just visible through the fanlight, and pale gold light leaking through the curtains of the first floor drawing room. That is it. That is what the house tells the world about itself at this hour. Inside, of course, it is a different story. The hall of the house is narrow, perhaps 8 feet wide, perhaps a little less. The walls are painted a calm green or a pale stone colour, or something that the architectural taste of the period considered restrained and proper. There is a stone-flagged floor because the entrance hall got the worst of the weather coming in on people's shoes, and stone could be mopped. There is a small console table against one wall, with the chamberstick supply on it for the end of the evening. There is a hat stand. There is a barometer mounted on the wall, because the barometer was the iPhone of the Regency household, most desired and most consulted piece of domestic technology, an instrument that gave you advance warning of the weather, which mattered enormously when going outside meant a carriage ride through unmade roads or a walk through the rain in shoes that were not waterproof. Hunchuak. The staircase rises from the back of the hall in a graceful single flight, up to a small landing, then turns and continues up to the first floor. The banisters are mahogany, polished by a housemaid's hands every morning. The carpet runs up the centre of the staircase, held in place by brass rods at the back of each step. The dining room off the hall is already prepared for dinner. The table is laid with white linen. The silver is on the sideboard. The candles in their silver candlesticks have not yet been lit. The fire in the grate is burning steadily, warming the room ahead of the family's arrival. The footman, who has been laying the table, is now at the sideboard, polishing a final wineglass against any imperfection. He is wearing his evening livery, which in this household consists of a dark blue coat, white breeches, white stockings, and a clean shirt. He has been on his feet since 6 in the morning, and he will be on them until at least 11 tonight. But his face is composed, his hands move efficiently, and he gives no outward sign of fatigue. Up the stairs to the first floor, the drawing room. This is the room we are going to spend the most time in tonight, so I want to describe it carefully. It is a long room, running the full width of the front of the house. 3 tall windows look out over the street, and they are all closed and curtained against the November cold. The walls are painted a warm colour, perhaps a soft yellow, perhaps a pale rose, because the Regency taste in interior colour was much warmer and brighter than the dark Victorian palette that would replace it a generation later. The cornices and ceiling are picked out in white. Above the chimney-piece is a large mirror in a gilded frame, doubling the light of the candles and the fire, making the room feel larger than it is. The furniture is arranged not in the static formality you sometimes see in museum reconstructions of period rooms, but in clusters around different points of activity. A circle of chairs and small tables near the fireplace, where the principal conversation will happen later in the evening. A pianoforte against one wall, with a music stand beside it, and a stool placed neatly in front of it. A square card table, currently folded against another wall, that will be brought out and set up later for whichever game the household decides to play tonight. A long sofa under the windows, with several cushions on it. A writing desk in one corner, where the mistress sometimes writes her letters in the afternoon light. A work basket beside one chair, full of needlework in progress. The fireplace itself is the main visual focus of the room. The grate is filled with burning coal, which by this period had largely replaced wood as the household fuel of choice in London, because coal burned hotter and the city's coal supply from Newcastle was reliable and abundant. The fire is being carefully tended. A small set of fire irons, polished steel, sits in a stand to the left of the hearth. The marble surround is decorated with small ornaments, a clock at the centre of the chimney-piece, 2 candlesticks flanking it, a pair of decorative figurines, perhaps a small bowl of dried flowers. On various small tables around the room, candles are burning in their holders. Beeswax candles, the expensive kind, smelling faintly of honey when they burn. The household has used 6 or 7 of them in the drawing room tonight, which is a considerable expense but necessary if any reading or sewing is going to happen. There are 2 candles on the pianoforte, in special brass branches that swing out from the case of the instrument so that the keys are illuminated. There is an argand lamp on the side table near the principal reading chair, which we will come to in a moment when we look at lighting in detail. What I want you to notice about this room before we move on is its scale and its intimacy. It is large enough to accommodate the whole family and several guests if needed. It is elegant enough to function as the formal social space of the household, the room in which visitors are received and entertained. But it is also small enough and softly enough lit that on a quiet November evening, with only the immediate family present, it feels enclosed and warm. The clusters of furniture pull people together rather than pushing them apart. The fire and the candles draw people toward the center of the room. The dark windows behind the drawn curtains remind everyone that the world outside is cold and dim, and that this, here, is where one belongs. This is the room we are going to spend most of our time in tonight. It is the room in which the entire idea of the Regency evening, the long, slow, candlelit gathering of a family at the end of its day, will take place. It is, in many ways, the most successful room ever designed for that purpose. We have not, in 2 centuries since, particularly improved on it. We have just stopped using rooms that way, and there is something to be said, I think, about going back and looking at this one carefully and asking what it offered that we have, perhaps without quite noticing, given up. But before we settle in to watch the family at their evening, we have to talk about the light, because everything we are going to see in this room, and everything they are going to do in it, depends on a particular kind of illumination that has almost entirely vanished from modern life. And the way that light worked, the things it could and could not do, the costs it imposed and the gifts it offered, deserves a chapter of its own. So let us turn now to the candles, the lamps, the firelight, the strange and lovely and slightly inconvenient world of pre-electric domestic illumination. Because once you understand what it actually meant to light a room with living flame, the whole evening looks different. Imagine for a moment that you have come into a room and there is no light, none at all. The fire in the grate has gone out, the candles are unlit, the windows show only the black of a winter night. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. You cannot find the door you just came through. You stand still, because moving in the dark is dangerous when there is furniture you might trip over. This is what every interior in the Regency world reverted to. Every night, the moment the candles went out, the dark was not a soft dark, the way modern dark almost always is. There was no streetlight glow leaking through the curtains. There was no LED indicator on a piece of equipment in the corner. There was no faint blue light from a phone left charging on a side table. The dark was complete in a way that almost no person in a developed country has experienced for more than a few moments at a time in the past century. Now into that dark picture, a single candle being struck and lit. The room does not light up. The room does not even particularly become visible. What becomes visible is a small spherical region around the flame, perhaps 6 feet across at the outside, in which you can now see things, and beyond which the room continues to be dark. The flame is yellow. It moves. It throws shadows that move with it. If you turn your head to look at something in the corner of the room, your eyes have to adjust, because the corner of the room is not lit, only the part of the room near the flame. And this is what light actually was for almost the entire history of indoor human life, a small mobile region of visibility, surrounded by dark that you carried with you or that you placed on a table and worked within the radius of. The transformation that electric lighting brought to the world, and that it really only in the last 140 years or so, was not the introduction of light. It was the introduction of evenly lit space. The idea that you could walk into a room, flip a switch, and have the entire room become as bright as a noon afternoon, with no shadows, no darker corners, no need to organize yourself near the source of illumination. It was a technological leap so transformative that I think we forget how recent it is. The Regency evening did not have that. It had candles. A candle in 1814 was, depending on the household and the room, one of 2 main types. Tallow candles were the cheaper option, made from animal fat, usually beef or mutton suet, rendered down and moulded around a wick of cotton or rush. They burned with a yellow flame, gave off a noticeable smell, smoked when the wick needed trimming, and required regular attention with a pair of snuffers, which were not, despite the name, used to put the candle out, but to trim the burnt end of the wick to keep it burning cleanly. A tallow candle that was not snuffed regularly would gutter, drip, and produce a quantity of black smoke that left soot on the ceiling above it. Tallow candles were used in the kitchen, in the servants' hall, in the back stairs, in the corridors, in the rooms where the family did not regularly sit. They cost roughly twopence each in this period, perhaps a little more depending on quality and supply. They burned for an hour or two before needing to be replaced. Beeswax candles were the better option. The candles used in the drawing room, the dining room, and the principal bedrooms. They were made from the wax of honeybees, refined and bleached to a pale gold or off-white colour, and moulded around higher quality wicks. They burned cleaner than tallow, with less smoke and almost no smell. They produced a warmer, more golden light. They cost considerably more. A pound of beeswax candles in 1814 would set the household back something in the neighbourhood of 2 shillings, which was a substantial sum, perhaps a day's wages for a skilled tradesman. The cost of light was, for the Regency household, a real and ongoing expense. Account books from comfortable middle-class households of the period show wax and tallow as a regular weekly outlay, often comparable to what was spent on meat or on coal. The amount of light you used was a marker of status, of seriousness about the activity at hand, of generosity toward your guests. To light a room with many candles was a sort of conspicuous consumption. To light it sparingly was a sign either of frugality or of a household that did not particularly expect to be observed in detail. There were unwritten rules. A drawing room set up for an evening of company would be lit much more brightly than a drawing room set up for the family alone. The dining table during a dinner party would have far more candles than the dining table during an everyday family dinner. When guests arrived, additional candles were lit, often by a footman moving silently around the room with a taper. When the guests left, the extras were extinguished. The household economy of light ran on a careful calculation of how much was needed, how much could be afforded, and how much was appropriate to the occasion. Beyond candles, there was the technological wonder of the period, the Argand lamp. The Argand lamp was the invention of a Swiss chemist named Amy Argand, patented in 1780, and gradually refined over the following decades. By the 1810s, it had become the gold standard of domestic illumination for those who could afford it. It burned whale oil, or sometimes colza oil from rapeseed, drawn up by capillary action through a wick that was shaped not as a flat ribbon, but as a cylindrical sleeve. Air was drawn up through the centre of the cylinder, as well as around the outside, which produced a much more complete combustion, a much brighter flame, and far less smoke than a candle. A glass chimney mounted above the burner protected the flame and improved the airflow further. The result was a lamp that produced something like 10 times the light of a single candle, with a steadier, whiter quality, and that could burn for many hours on a single filling of oil. A single Argand lamp on a side table in the drawing room would dramatically change the practical quality of the evening for the people sitting near it. You could read by it comfortably for hours. You could do detailed needlework. You could write a letter at the writing desk, with the lamp positioned to cast its light over your paper. The Argand lamp was, in a real sense, the first piece of indoor lighting technology that began to approach what we would now consider an ordinary desk lamp. Most middle-class households of the period had at least one Argand lamp by the 1810s, and many had several. They were status objects as well as practical ones. The reservoir of oil and the brass burner were often elaborately decorated. The shade above the chimney could be of frosted glass, of porcelain, of any number of decorative materials. A good Argand lamp was the kind of thing that family pride could attach itself to. the kind of object that would be passed down to a younger relative when the household moved on to the next innovation. Beyond argon lamps, the truly futuristic possibility, in 1814, was gas. The first gas streetlights had been installed on Pall Mall in 1807, demonstrated by the German entrepreneur Frederick Albert Windsor, and over the following years gas lighting had begun to spread, first to other London streets, then to public buildings, then very tentatively to a few private houses. By 1814, the Gas Light and Coke Company was supplying gas to a growing portion of central London, and the new technology was visibly transforming the appearance of the city's streets at night. Where the old oil street lamps had given off a feeble yellow glimmer, gas lamps produced a brighter, whiter light that allowed pedestrians for the first time to actually see the pavement they were walking on after dark. But gas in the home was still, in 1814, an extreme novelty. The infrastructure required, the fittings and pipes, and the perpetual risk of leakage and explosion made it unsuitable for most domestic use. It would be another 20 years before gas lighting became common in middle-class houses, and even then it would be confined initially to public rooms and corridors, with bedrooms still lit by candles deep into the Victorian period. In 1814, our family is reading and playing cards by exactly the same kind of light that their grandparents and great-grandparents had used. Wax candle, tallow candle, argand lamp, the fire in the grate. Now, what does this actually mean for the evening? It means, first of all, that the evening is organized around small islands of light. A drawing room may have 10 or 12 candles burning in it, but they are not distributed evenly. They are clustered at the points where people are doing things. The pianoforte, the card table when it is set up, the reading chair, the fireplace. The space between these clusters, the part of the room that is just rug and air, falls away into a softer, dimmer half-light. The corners, where nothing is happening, may be effectively dark. This means, second, that activities happen close to the light source. You do not, in 1814, sit in a chair 15 feet from the nearest candle and read your book. You sit beside the table that has the lamp on it. If two people are reading, they are sitting next to each other, sharing the same pool of light. If a daughter is playing the pianoforte, the candles on the music branches are close enough to her face that she can read the music. The rest of the room beyond the keyboard fades out of her immediate awareness as she plays. There is a physical proximity required by the candle that simply is not required by the electric bulb, and this proximity has consequences for how the household occupies its rooms. It means, third, that everything moves a little more slowly. You cannot dart across a candlelit room without putting out the flame in your hand. You cannot leap up suddenly without disturbing the work of the person beside you. The candle teaches a slower kind of movement, a more deliberate way of being in a space. The Regency evening had an unhurried physical pace, partly because hurry was not what the lighting could support. It means, fourth, that the evening has a natural duration. Candles burn for a finite period before they need to be replaced. A pound of beeswax burns for about 10 hours of useful illumination, divided among however many candles you have lit at any given moment. A household budgeting carefully for its evening light has a real, measurable supply of illumination, and when that supply runs out, the night runs out with it. The fact that most middle-class Regency families went to bed somewhere between 10 and 11 was not coincidence. It was the natural reach of the evening's lighting. Beyond a certain hour, you had to start putting candles out, and once they were out, the only sensible thing left to do was sleep, and it means, fifth and finally, that the dark is a real and constant companion. It is at the edges of every lit space. It is in the corners of every room. It is on the staircase as you climb it, on the landing as you turn for your bedroom, in the hall as you cross to the front door to make sure it is locked for the night. The dark does not go away in the Regency house. It only retreats slightly to wherever the light is not. and when the household goes to bed and the candles are all snuffed, it returns instantly to fill every room. The whole house becomes one continuous dark space again, with the exception of the few small fires still glowing in their grates, which will go out by themselves before morning. That is the world we are about to spend our evening in. A world lit, but not lit like ours. A world in which seeing was a deliberate act, requiring fuel and attention. A world in which the primary social space of the family was a soft golden room with a fire in it, surrounded on all sides by greater dark. I think that is a beautiful world in many ways, and a world worth understanding from the inside. So let us go now into the next phase of the evening, the one that begins as the lamps and candles are being lit, and that has perhaps been the single most enduring and most particular ritual of British domestic life ever since. Let us talk about tea. There is something I want you to understand about tea in 1814 before we sit down at the small round table where the mistress of the house is going to pour. By this period, tea had been part of British domestic life for about 150 years. It had arrived in the second half of the 17th century as an exotic luxury, drunk in coffeehouses by men of fashion, slowly making its way into the houses of the wealthy. By the 18th century, it had become an established afternoon ritual in the upper classes. By the early 19th century, it had spread down through the comfortable middle classes and was beginning to reach into respectable working-class households as well. It had become, over those decades, more than a drink. It had become a structure for the day, a ritual that organized the late afternoon, that gave women in particular a context for sociability, that occupied the strange transitional hour between the end of the working day and the beginning of dinner. The hour of tea in this period was around 5 in the afternoon, though it shifted with the season and with the social schedule of the household. Earlier in winter, when dinner came earlier, tea might happen at 4. Later in the social season, when fashionable households dined at 7 or even 8, tea would correspondingly shift later. The principle was simple. Tea filled the gap. It was the bridge between the labour of the afternoon and the formality of the evening meal. In our household tonight, tea has been served at 4:30. The mistress and her elder daughter took it together in the drawing room with a few small cakes, while the master of the house was still at his chambers. By the time he returned, the tea things had been cleared, but I want to pause here and look at the ritual of tea itself. Because of all the small, repeated acts of the Regency evening, this one is perhaps the most distinctive, the most carefully choreographed, and the most lasting in its influence on the subsequent 200 years of British life. The tea equipage, as it was called, was a set of objects that lived in the drawing room or in a special cabinet near it. It included, at minimum, a teapot, a milk jug, a sugar bowl, a slop bowl for the dregs, a set of cups and saucers, a set of teaspoons, and a tea caddy. It often included also a hot water jug, a tea strainer, a sugar nips, a small tea kettle, and a stand for the kettle that allowed it to be heated over a small spirit lamp at the table. Of these objects, the tea caddy was the most carefully guarded. The tea caddy was a small, often beautifully made wooden box, sometimes lined with foil or with separate compartments for different varieties of tea, in which the household kept its leaves. And, crucially, the tea caddy locked. It locked because tea, in this period, was expensive enough to be worth stealing. It was kept in the mistress's domain, in a drawer she alone had the key to, or in the caddy itself, with the key on her chatelaine. The act of unlocking the caddy and measuring out the tea was hers, and hers alone to perform. No servant ever measured the tea. No servant ever had the key. The mistress did it herself with a small silver scoop, putting a measured quantity into the warm teapot and adding the boiling water with her own hands. This may sound like an absurd level of fussiness about a beverage, but the price of tea in 1814 was genuinely high. Black tea was running at something like 10 or 12 shillings the pound, which is to say a substantial fraction of a working man's weekly wages for what would now be considered a single pound of leaves. Tea was taxed heavily, smuggled extensively, and adulterated frequently with sloe leaves, willow leaves, and various other substitutes that were sold to the unwary as the genuine article. The mistress who measured her own tea with her own hands was protecting an expensive household commodity from theft and adulteration both. The locked caddy was not snobbery, it was sound household management. Now, the actual sequence of making tea was a small piece of choreography that the mistress performed at her tea table with a quantity of attention that I think is worth describing carefully. The teapot was warmed first by pouring a little of the boiling water from the kettle into it, swirling it around, and pouring it out. Then the leaves were measured in. Then the boiling water was added, and the lid replaced. A few minutes of brewing time passed, during which the mistress made the conversation flow, asked her guests how they took their tea, whether milk, whether sugar, how much. The cups were arranged on their saucers. When the tea was ready, it was poured carefully into each cup, with the mistress offering each completed cup to her guest with a small word of acknowledgement. Sugar was added with the silver tongs from the bowl, by the guests themselves, or by the mistress depending on the formality of the occasion. Milk was added by the mistress as the cup was poured, again according to the guest's stated preference. The whole process for a small group might take 20 minutes from the kettle being placed on the lamp to the last cup being handed across, and it was, in those 20 minutes, the central social activity of the room. Conversation gathered around the tea table. People watched the mistress's hands. They watched the way she measured and poured. They watched how she made each guest feel attended to in the small specific way of having their cup made for them by her. While they watched, this is, I think, the part of the tea ritual that we tend to underestimate. It was not just that everyone was drinking the same drink at the same time. It was that the drink was being made slowly and carefully, in front of them, by the woman of the house, with her own hands as a form of hospitality that was direct, personal, and visible. There was no waiter. There was no kitchen staff bringing finished cups out from another room. There was the mistress, the kettle, the leaves, the cups, and the people she was offering them to. The whole thing happened in the open, in real time, and everyone watched. A guest unfamiliar with the household etiquette might encounter, during a Regency tea, a small but specific puzzle. The cups in this period often did not have handles. They were small, broad-rimmed, and held by the saucer, or by the cup itself with a handkerchief between the hand and the porcelain. When you had finished your tea and did not wish for another cup, the convention was to place your spoon across the top of your cup, or to invert the cup on its saucer. If you simply set the cup down without performing this small signal, the mistress would assume you wanted another cup and would offer one. There were guests in this period who, having not understood the convention, were filled with cup after cup of tea against their will, unable to find a polite way to communicate their desire to stop, until at last someone took pity and explained it to them. I find that detail genuinely charming. It is the kind of small social protocol that whole societies develop and forget, and it tells you something about how seriously this particular household ritual was taken, that there were unwritten rules about how to communicate the end of one's participation in it. Tea was usually accompanied by something small to eat, bread and butter cut very thin, small cakes. Sandwiches were not yet quite the institution they would become later in the century, though something approaching them was beginning to appear. A toasting fork by the fire, with bread being toasted by one of the daughters or by a younger guest, was a common sight. Toasted bread, spread with butter, was a perfectly acceptable accompaniment to afternoon tea, and the toasting itself was a small cooperative activity that the family could perform together. The toast was held to the fire, turned, watched, removed. When it was the right shade of gold, buttered while still warm, passed to whoever wanted it, What we are looking at here when we look at the tea ritual carefully is a small daily theatre of attention. It was a piece of performance hospitality that the mistress staged in her own drawing room, several times a week if she had visitors, and once or twice a day even when she did not. It taught her, over the years, a particular set of skills. The skill of paying attention to several people at once. The skill of noticing what each guest wanted without their having to ask. The skill of making the practical work of making tea look effortless and graceful. These are not small skills. They are, in fact, the same skills that any good host or good professional in any era has to develop. The Regency tea ritual gave middle-class women, in the daily practice of pouring out for their families and visitors, a context in which to develop those skills to a very high level. And, perhaps more importantly, it gave them a reliable, repeatable, daily structure through which to assert their authority within the domestic space. The drawing room was hers. The tea things were hers. The act of pouring was hers. No one else in the household, no servant, no child, no husband, presided over that small ceremony. She did, and that mattered in a society which gave women very few other domains in which to preside. I think this is one of the reasons the tea ritual lasted so long in British life. It was not just about the beverage, it was about a daily performance of household authority that was small, repeated, intimate, and essentially uncontested. Long after the economic conditions that originally created it had changed, long after tea became cheap and the locked caddy became unnecessary, the basic shape of the ritual continued to be performed in middle-class British households, in some form or other, well into the 21st century. The mistress pouring out for her guests is one of the most enduring small images of British domestic life, and it began in the form we recognize in households exactly like the one we are visiting tonight. But tea, in this household, on this November evening, has been over for an hour now. The cups have been cleared away. The kettle is back below stairs. The mistress has gone upstairs briefly to change for dinner, and the next great event of the evening is approaching. Dinner in 1814, in a comfortable middle-class London household, was the central meal of the day. It was the meal at which the family gathered formally, at which any guests who had been invited would be received, at which the silver and the linen and the best plates came out, at which a quantity of food was served that would by modern standards seem extraordinarily ambitious for what was nominally a domestic meal. The hour of dinner had been moving steadily later through the previous half-century. In the middle of the 18th century, dinner had been eaten at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. By 1800, it had migrated to 4 or 5. By 1814, in fashionable households, it was being eaten at 6 or 7, and in the most fashionable circles where dining was a social performance attended by guests, dinner could begin as late as 8 in the evening. Our household, comfortable but not fashionable, has settled on 6 o'clock as its dinner hour. The clock in the dining room is showing 20 minutes to 6. The candles on the dining table are about to be lit. The first dish has been brought up from the kitchen and placed on the sideboard, ready to be served once everyone is seated. What comes to that table is worth describing, because the manner of dinner service in 1814 was different from anything that exists in normal restaurant or domestic dining today. The form of service used in middle-class English households of this period was called service à la française, the French style. What this meant, in practice, was that the food for each course of the dinner was placed on the table all at once, in a symmetrical arrangement of dishes, and the diners served themselves and each other from the dishes nearest to them. The course did not consist of a single dish for each person. It consisted of an entire ensemble of dishes set out on the table together, from which everyone drew portions according to their preference. A typical first course in a household of this kind, on an ordinary family dinner, might include a soup at one end of the table and a fish dish at the other end, with 3 or 4 side dishes of meat, vegetables, or sauce arranged between them. A roast might occupy the center of the table. The entire course would be on the table at once, and the diners would help themselves and offer to one another. Once everyone had eaten enough of this course, the dishes would be removed by the footman, and the second course would be brought up. The second course would be similarly composed of multiple dishes, generally with more variety and less heaviness than the first, perhaps with a particular emphasis on poultry or game and on more delicate side dishes. After that, dessert. Fruit, jellies, custards, sometimes cake, sometimes ices in the warmer months when ice could be obtained from the household ice store or from a commercial supplier. The total quantity of food on the table during such a dinner was considerable, and the consumption per person was, by our standards, surprisingly modest. The dishes were ornamental as much as practical. They were arranged for the eye as much as for the appetite. A well-laid table à la Française was a kind of architectural composition in food, with the symmetry of the dishes and the proportions of the arrangement being the responsibility of the cook below stairs and the footman who set the table above. The conversation during such a dinner was, by Regency convention, focused on the people seated nearest to you. You were expected to speak to your neighbour on the right and left, and not to attempt conversation across the table or down its length. The mistress and the master sat at opposite ends of the table, and the conversation flowed in two roughly separate streams, one focused around each end. This may sound formal, but in a household of 6 or 8 people, it produced a more intimate and easier conversation than a single shared discussion would have done. You could speak quietly. You could listen carefully. You did not have to compete with 7 other voices for the attention of the room. The candles on the dining table provided enough light to see your plate and your immediate neighbour's face clearly. They did not provide enough light to see the whole length of the table sharply. The far end of the table, where the mistress sat, would have been visible only as a soft impression of figures and motion. The faces nearest to you, lit warmly by candle, were the faces you actually saw. This is again a feature of the lighting that shaped the social experience. Dinner by candlelight was an intimate dinner with one's neighbours, even when 10 people were present. The room itself dropped into pleasant indistinctness beyond the immediate radius of the candles, and the actual social circle one inhabited at any given moment was very small. The food itself, in a middle-class household of this period, would have been a mixture of roasted meats, boiled meats, made dishes that today we would call ragouts or stews, vegetables boiled or stewed, sauces of various kinds, and, depending on the season, fish either bought fresh from a fishmonger or in poorer households salted and brought up from store. The good cook could produce a respectable family dinner of 2 courses and a dessert from materials that the housekeeper had bought at the market that morning, and could do it in a kitchen that by modern standards was poorly equipped, dimly lit, and dependent on a coal-fired range that required constant tending. The wine served at dinner was generally claret, which is to say red Bordeaux, or sometimes port, which by this period had become a particularly British favourite. Sherry was sometimes served with the soup. Madeira appeared at the dessert. The exact selection depended on the household cellar and the master's preferences. Wine was poured by the footman as the meal progressed, and was an integral part of the dinner from start to finish. What I want to draw your attention to about the dinner ritual is the way it organised the family around a single shared act, performed slowly, at considerable expense, with a great deal of ceremony, lit by candle, with a quantity of food that exceeded what was strictly necessary as a way of marking the occasion as special. Every dinner, even an ordinary family dinner, was a small daily performance of the household's resources and its capacity to feed itself well. And, like the tea ritual earlier, it was a practice of attention to one's neighbour at the table, to the food, to the performance of one's role as a member of the family, dressed properly, behaving properly, contributing to the conversation properly. By around 7:30 in our household, dinner has reached its end. The dessert plates have been cleared, the fruit has been picked, the jellies sampled, the small cakes acknowledged. The mistress has caught her elder daughter's eye across the table and given her a small nod, which is the signal both of them have been waiting for. What happens next is one of the most distinctive moments of the Regency evening, and it deserves a section of its own. The mistress rises from her seat at the foot of the table. The other women in the party rise with her. The men, including the master, also rise to their feet, in observance of the small ceremony of the moment. The mistress nods, smiles, and leads the women out of the dining room. The men remain. The door is closed behind the departing women. This was the ritual of withdrawal, and it was one of the strict observances of polite English life in this period. After the formal dinner, the women left the dining room to go to the drawing room upstairs. The men remained at the dining table, where the cloth was now removed, the dessert dishes cleared, decanters of port and claret brought out, and a different kind of conversation began. The room in which the women now find themselves, the drawing room on the first floor, is exactly as we left it earlier. The fire has been kept up by a housemaid who slipped in during dinner. The candles are burning steadily. The argand lamp on the side table has been lit and trimmed. A coffee tray has been set out on the small round table near the fire, with coffee in a silver pot and small cups in a set, and a tiny silver cream jug and a sugar bowl. The mistress goes to the table and pours coffee for her daughters and any women guests, much as she would have poured tea earlier. The conversation here, in the drawing room, in the absence of the men, takes on a different texture. The Regency convention of withdrawing was understood, in part, as a way of allowing both groups, men and women, to talk among themselves on subjects considered more suitable for their own company. The men downstairs would now begin to discuss politics, business, the affairs of the day, in language and detail that polite convention regarded as unsuitable for the women's hearing. The women, upstairs, would talk more freely about social matters, about families and connections, about subjects that the presence of the men, and especially of any visiting men not closely related to the family, would have constrained. It is easy to read the withdrawal ritual now and see only its limitations. The implicit suggestion that women's conversation and men's conversation must be separated. The reinforcement of distinct social spheres for the two sexes. These observations are fair as far as they go, and historians of the period have documented at length the constraints that this and related conventions placed on the participation of women in serious public conversation. But there is another way to look at it. The withdrawal also gave the women a reliable, daily, formal interval of female-only sociability in their own space, on their own terms, which they used in any number of ways. They talked about books they were reading. They talked about music they were learning. They talked about their children's progress, their friends' troubles, the small but consequential business of running a household and a family in a complicated city. They formed bonds, mother to daughter, sister to sister, friend to friend, in the kind of unhurried, undisturbed intervals that women in our era often have to schedule deliberately, because nothing in our daily structure provides them automatically. There is a paradox here that I think deserves to be acknowledged. The same convention that excluded women from one kind of conversation also gave them, every evening, a reliable space for another. Whether the trade was worthwhile is a question that the historical participants themselves would probably have answered differently, depending on their temperament and their circumstances. It is not for us, looking back, to render the verdict for them. Meanwhile, downstairs, the men are settling into their own version of the post-dinner hour. The cloth has been removed from the table, leaving the polished mahogany surface clean and gleaming. Decanters of wine have been brought to the head of the table where the master sits. The candles have been trimmed. The fire is kept up. The men, now reduced to a smaller circle than the original dinner party, draw their chairs closer together. The decanter is passed from one to the next, around the table, in the established order. Each man pours for himself, takes the decanter from his neighbour, fills his own glass, and passes it on. The conversation here is different, as we said. It can be more direct, more pointed, more unguarded. The political news from Westminster, the latest war news, in a year when news from the Continental armies was still arriving with weekly gravity. The condition of the markets, the state of the master's professional or commercial affairs. The men in this hour do a particular kind of male sociability that was in this period one of the principal functions of dinner itself. The decanter goes round, the candles burn, the wine takes some of the formality off the conversation. The men say things to one another that they would not have said in front of the women, and that they will not say to one another the following morning, when the daylight returns. There is a distinct intimacy of the evening meal table that recurs across many cultures and many periods, and that the Regency dinner gave a particular form. How long does this separation last? In a relaxed, ordinary family dinner with no significant guests, perhaps 3/4 of an hour, perhaps an hour. In a more formal dinner with guests, perhaps longer, particularly if the men were enjoying themselves and the wine was of good quality. The mistress upstairs would take her cue from her sense of how long was reasonable, and from the time of evening, and would eventually decide that it had gone on long enough. But she would not send a servant to fetch the men. The men would come up of their own accord, prompted by the master, when the master judged the moment right. The reunion of the company in the drawing room, after the men came up, was the moment when the second half of the evening properly began. A footman would bring up the tea things again, this time for a smaller and later tea, sometimes called evening tea, or simply the tea, served in the drawing room with the company assembled. Sometimes coffee was offered as an alternative, because by this period coffee was almost as common a domestic drink as tea, particularly among men. The household tea things came out a second time. The mistress poured, men sat down with the women, and the social geometry of the room reconstituted itself. This reconstitution was, I think, the actual emotional centre of the Regency evening. The dinner had been formal, with all of its small choreographies. The withdrawal had been the necessary pause between formal dinner and informal evening. And now the evening proper began, the men and women in the same room. The pianoforte open, perhaps, and one of the daughters about to be invited to play, the card table being set up by a footman, the books being reached for, the work baskets being settled beside the chairs. The night's actual entertainments, whatever the household chose to do that evening, beginning to take shape. And here, again, what I want to emphasize is the unhurried pace of all of this. There was no schedule, there was no agenda. The card game would happen when it happened, and would last as long as it lasted. The pianoforte would be played when one of the players felt ready to play, and not before. Reading aloud might begin at one point, pause for tea, resume later, pause again for conversation. The whole shape of the evening was responsive to the interest and energy of the people in the room, and could last as long or as short a time as they wanted it to. This responsiveness is, I think, one of the things we have lost and worth thinking about. When you are entertained by a screen, the schedule of the entertainment is determined by the producers of the content, not by you. The episode is 45 minutes long, whether you want it to be or not. The film is 2 hours long. The video continues until it has been watched. You can pause it, of course, but the unit of entertainment is not really under your control. In the Regency drawing room, by contrast, the unit of entertainment was whatever the household chose to make it. A piece of music could be 3 minutes long or 10. A reading aloud could be a chapter or a paragraph. A card game could go on for an hour or for the whole evening. The texture of time was loose and elastic, organized around the pleasure of the people in the room rather than around the duration of the activity itself. And it is to those activities that we now turn, because the heart of the Regency evening, the thing that made it identifiable as Regency, was what the family did in the drawing room after dinner. The reading, the music, the cards, the conversation. These were not peripheral. They were the entire point of the evening, and each of them deserves to be looked at carefully on its own terms. So let us begin with reading aloud. Because of all the entertainments of the Regency drawing room, this one is perhaps the most lost, the most particular, and the most worth understanding. There was a particular sound that filled Regency drawing rooms in the evening. The sound of a single human voice reading slowly and carefully, with attention to phrasing, with consideration for the rhythm of the sentence, while the rest of the family sat in their chairs around the fire and listened. The sound of an entire small household paying attention, together, to language being given out by one of its members, in the hearing of all the others. We do not in our world have very much occasion to do this. Reading, for most of us, is a private act. We read silently, alone, in our own time and our own pace. The book communicates with us individually, without going through the medium of another person's voice. This way of reading is so deeply assumed in our culture that it is easy to forget that for most of European literary history, reading aloud was at least as common as silent reading, and arguably more important to the way books were experienced. In the Regency household, reading aloud was a regular, almost daily evening activity. The form it took varied, sometimes one member of the family, often the master or one of the older children, read for an extended period from a longer work, with the rest of the family doing other things, sewing or playing chess, or simply sitting and listening. Sometimes the reading was passed from one person to another, a chapter each, around the circle. Sometimes there were short readings of poetry between other activities, with someone picking up a slim volume from a side table and reading a single piece aloud as a kind of small offering to the room. The books that were read aloud in this period are worth pausing on, because they tell you something about the tastes and the imagination of the time. Walter Scott was in 1814, in the middle of his great novel-writing decade. His verse romances had been published over the previous several years, beginning with The Lay of the Last Minstrel in 1805, then Marmion in 1808, then The Lady of the Lake in 1810. These had been wildly popular, and they had been written, among other things, with reading aloud in mind. The long lines of verse, the dramatic narrative structure, the descriptive passages of Scottish landscape, all suited a household audience listening to the voice of a single reader by the fire. And in 1814 Scott had published anonymously his first novel, Waverley, which had become a sensation. By the November of that year, copies of Waverley were already appearing in private circulating libraries across England, and being read aloud in households like the one we are visiting tonight. There was also the poetry of William Cowper, whose long meditative poems had been part of the standard household reading for a generation. The Task, published in 1785, was particularly suited to evening reading. It was not narrative-driven in the way Scott's verse was. It was contemplative, descriptive, gentle in tone, full of small observations of country life and domestic happiness that felt right to read aloud while a family sat together by candlelight. Cowper had a way of writing about the everyday world, the garden, the parlour, the winter walk, the book on the table, in language that gave dignity and tenderness to ordinary things, and his work was treasured by exactly the kind of household we are visiting. There was the poetry of George Crabbe, whose verse tales of village life had been collected and published in the previous decade and were considered, with some affection, to be among the most truthful accounts of English rural existence anyone had yet given. Crabbe was not always cheerful, but he was respected, and his work was read aloud often. There was Lord Byron, of course. Byron had become famous overnight in 1812 with the publication of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. His Eastern verse tales, the Giaour, the Bride of Abydos, the Corsair, the Lara, had appeared in 1813 and 1814 in a rapid succession that no one could keep up with. Byron was, by the end of 1814, the most fashionable living poet in England. and his work was being read aloud in drawing rooms across the country, often with a degree of mild embarrassment, because Byron was understood to be a slightly dangerous figure whose own life suggested moral irregularities that conservative households were not entirely comfortable about. But the verse itself was electric, and the temptation to read it aloud was enormous, and so it was read. There was the poetry of Mrs. Hardemy, Hemans and other women poets whose work was widely respected in this period, and who would have been household names in 1814. Even if they have faded somewhat from our own literary consciousness, Milton was always available. Shakespeare was read aloud, particularly the comedies and the historical plays, sometimes in family-only readings where different parts were taken by different members of the household. Pope was still in regular currency. The poetry of the previous century had not yet receded into something one had to study in school. It was still living, breathing material that any educated household might pick up on a winter evening and read. There were novels. Jane Austen had published Sense and Sensibility in 1811, and Pride and Prejudice in 1813, and Mansfield Park in 1814. These were anonymous, attributed only to a lady or to the author of her previous works. They were enormously popular among the kind of households we are visiting, though Austen's name was not yet attached to them publicly. There was Maria Edgeworth, whose novels and tales of fashionable life were considered both entertaining and morally improving, and were read in many households. There were the Gothic novels of Anne Radcliffe and her imitators, which had been the publishing sensation of the 1790s, and were still on the shelves of the circulating libraries, being read by the daughters of the house on rainy afternoons, and being mocked gently by their mothers in the evenings. There were sermons. This may sound strange to a modern reader, but published volumes of sermons were a major category of reading in Regency households, particularly on Sundays. The sermons of distinguished clergymen were collected and printed and bought and shelved in ordinary middle-class libraries, and they were read aloud, often by the master of the household, on Sunday evenings, as a continuation of the morning's church-going. The 18th century had been a great age of sermon publishing, and the inheritance of that culture was still alive in the Regency drawing room. There were essays. The essays of Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, originally published in The Spectator and The Tatler at the beginning of the previous century, were still considered models of polite English prose and were part of the standard household library. The essays of Samuel Johnson, more weighty in tone, were read by the more serious members of the family. The essays of more recent writers, including the periodical literature of the day, were read aloud, particularly to share an interesting article or piece of news with the rest of the household. There were travels. Books of travel writing were enormously popular in this period, partly because the Napoleonic Wars had made actual travel for ordinary middle-class English people very difficult or impossible for over 20 years, and the appetite to read about places one could not visit was correspondingly intense. Travels in the Levant, in the Holy Land, in the West Indies, in North America, in the Highlands of Scotland, all had their devoted readers. The reading aloud of a travel book was one of the ways a household could move imaginatively beyond its own street. And there were newspapers. The newspapers of the period, the Times, the Morning Post, the Morning Chronicle, were physically large and dense with type, and were often read aloud by the master of the household in the drawing room after dinner. He would read a particular article, or a particular debate from Parliament, or a piece of foreign news, and the family would listen and discuss what they had heard. The newspaper in this period was not really a private medium, it was a domestic one. It came into the house in the morning, was read at breakfast or during the day, and then was read aloud again in the evening, for the benefit of those members of the family who had not had the chance to read it themselves. What I want you to notice about all of this reading is what it produced in the room while it was happening. The reader, sitting in a chair near the principal candle or the argand lamp with the book in their hands, was the focus of the room's attention. They were performing the text. They were giving voice to language that, until they spoke it, was silent on the page. The way they read mattered. A good reader could make a passage of verse come alive, could give a comic novel its proper rhythm, could make a sermon thoughtful and moving rather than dry. A less skilled reader could deflate the same material entirely. The reading was not a neutral act. It was an act of interpretation and performance, and the household in front of the reader heard it that way. The listeners, meanwhile, were doing several things at once. They were listening, of course, but they were often also doing something with their hands. Sewing was extremely common, particularly for the women, who would have a piece of embroidery or hemming or some other small piece of needlework to occupy their hands while their ears followed the reading. Men sometimes carved or repaired small things. A daughter might be writing a letter, looking up to listen at intervals. Children, when they were old enough to be in the drawing room, sat quietly and were expected to listen, and were occasionally asked questions afterward about what had been read. This combination of activities, reading and listening and small handwork, was understood by the period as a particularly satisfying form of evening entertainment. The hands were occupied, which meant the body was not restless. The ears were occupied, which meant the mind was held by the text. The room was held together, all of its inhabitants attending to the same thing at once, in a way that made the whole household feel like a single small audience. I want to give you a particular figure who was in the period much associated with the practice of family reading, because she was a writer of conduct literature, whose work was read in many households of this kind. Her name was Hannah More, and her many books on domestic conduct and Christian education recommended reading aloud in the family circle as one of the best forms of evening entertainment. She argued that it bound the family together, that it provided moral and intellectual nourishment, that it occupied the time more wholesomely than card playing or other amusements that she regarded with reservation. Whether households actually followed her advice in detail is debatable, but her vision of the family reading evening was widely shared and widely realized. The Regency reading aloud, in its best form, produced a particular kind of attention that is increasingly hard to find in modern life. It was an attention shared with other people. It was an attention sustained over a long period, an hour or more at a stretch. It was an attention that did not have to fight against rival demands from screens or notifications or any of the other small thieves of focus that we live among. It was an attention given over willingly to language in the company of family. That attention, I think, was one of the great quiet achievements of Regency domestic life. It is also one of the things that the people we are watching tonight, sitting in their drawing room with the book and the fire and the candles, would not particularly have thought of as remarkable. To them, it was just what one did in the evening. The fact that 2 centuries later we look at it and see something almost rare and almost precious is a function of our own circumstances, not of theirs. But reading aloud was not the only entertainment of the Regency drawing room. After the reading, or sometimes in alternation with it, there was music, and music in the Regency household, in the early 19th century, was almost entirely organized around one particular instrument, the pianoforte. Now, the pianoforte deserves more than a passing mention, because by 1814 it had become, in the kind of household we are visiting tonight, almost the central object of female accomplishment, female entertainment, and female sociability within the home. To understand what the instrument meant to the people who used it, we have to understand a little bit of its history, of its place in the social structure of the period. The pianoforte was a relatively new instrument in historical terms. The harpsichord had been the standard keyboard instrument of the previous century, and harpsichords were still found in many older households, particularly those that had inherited them from earlier generations. But the pianoforte, with its capacity to play both loud and soft, both forte and piano, and its more responsive touch, had been steadily replacing the harpsichord since the late 18th century. By 1814, a new household setting up its drawing room would buy a pianoforte. A harpsichord would have been considered old-fashioned, even charmingly so, but not really the right instrument for the modern young woman to learn on. The pianoforte in our drawing room is what was then called a square piano, despite the name a rectangular instrument standing on 4 turned legs, with a hinged top that lifted to reveal the keyboard and the strings inside. Square pianos were the standard domestic instrument of the period. They were smaller and cheaper than the grand piano, which was found mainly in concert halls and very wealthy private houses. They were more elegant and more compact than the upright piano, which would not be commonly seen until somewhat later. The square piano fit beautifully into the standard middle-class drawing room, took up perhaps the space of a small writing desk, and could be moved by a couple of strong servants if the room had to be rearranged. The case of the instrument was usually mahogany, sometimes inlaid with other woods or with brass detailing. The keyboard had a range of about 5 octaves, somewhat narrower than a modern piano, but quite sufficient for the music of the period. The action was lighter than a modern action, and the tone was sweeter, more delicate, less powerful, with a particular silvery quality that any modern listener encountering a properly preserved Regency Square piano will immediately recognize as different from the heavier, more resonant tone of a contemporary instrument. The candles on the music branches on either side of the keyboard threw light onto the keys and onto the music propped on the stand above them. The music played on this instrument, in this household, on this evening, was a particular repertoire that was almost entirely separate from the public concert music of the day, and which deserves a moment of attention. The bulk of domestic piano music in 1814 consisted of arrangements, transcriptions, and shorter original works composed specifically for the amateur player at home. The works of Joseph Haydn, who had died only 5 years earlier and whose reputation was at its height, were widely played in domestic settings, particularly his shorter sonatas and his various sets of pieces composed with the amateur in mind. Mozart was played, though some of his more demanding sonatas were considered beyond the reach of the average drawing-room player. Muzio Clementi, the Italian pianist and composer who had settled in London and become both a composer and a piano manufacturer, had produced a vast output of piano music aimed at exactly the domestic market we are looking at. His sonatas and sonatinas were standard teaching pieces. Beethoven was beginning to enter this domestic repertoire, though his more recent works were considered, by some, to be difficult and almost shocking in their emotional intensity. There were vast quantities of song. Songs were perhaps even more central to the Regency drawing room than purely instrumental music, because singing was something that brought the whole company into participation. The songbook sat on top of the piano. The accompanist played. The singer, often a young woman of the household, sang. The other members of the family listened, applauded, sometimes joined in the chorus if the song allowed it. Italian songs, English songs, Scottish songs, Irish songs. The Scottish and Irish folk repertoire had become particularly fashionable in this period, partly under the influence of Walter Scott, and partly through the publishing efforts of various song collectors. The Irish melodies of Thomas Moore, which had begun to appear in 1808, and which would continue to be published in volumes through the next decade, were enormously popular. The Scottish songs collected and arranged by various publishers, sometimes with new poetic settings by Robert Burns, were standard drawing-room repertoire. There were piano arrangements of opera arias, of orchestral pieces, of every kind of music that the household might have heard at a public concert and wished to hear again at home. The arrangement of orchestral music for piano, or for piano and voice, was a vast publishing industry in this period. Every popular opera that had its season at the King's Theatre in London was, within months, available in a piano and voice reduction that could be purchased and played at home. And there were dances, country dances written down with their tunes and their figures, so that families could play them when they wanted to dance, or simply listen to them as sprightly entertainment after dinner. Quadrille music, which had become fashionable in the previous few years. The waltz was just beginning to be heard in respectable English households in 1814, though it was still mildly controversial because of the closeness of the partner's embrace, and many older members of polite society regarded it with disapproval. This music was, in 1814, almost entirely played by women. There were exceptions. Some men played the piano well, and the master of the household might sit down at it occasionally, particularly to accompany his wife or daughter in a song. But the regular domestic player of the pianoforte in this period was almost always female. The young daughters of the household were taught to play from an early age by a series of music masters who came to the house once or twice a week to give lessons. Their daily practice was an unvarying part of the household routine. By the time they were 16 or 17, the elder daughters of a family like the one we are visiting tonight could play with some skill, sing in pleasant voices, accompany themselves and one another, and provide an evening's entertainment for the family without difficulty. The whole institution of female accomplishment, as it was called in this period, deserves a moment of attention. Music, drawing, French, Italian, dancing, fine needlework, a little bit of botanical knowledge, literary knowledge. These were the accomplishments that a young woman of the comfortable middle classes was expected to have acquired by the time she came out into society and began to be considered for marriage. They were what a suitable wife would bring to a household, in the form of evening entertainment, of polite conversation, of the cultivation of children's later education, and of a general atmosphere of refinement. It was understood to be the wife's responsibility to maintain. The accomplishments have, in our era, sometimes been criticized or even mocked as a kind of decorative training that fitted women for nothing useful. There is something to that criticism, certainly. The young woman who could play 3 Haydn sonatas competently was not being prepared for any career, was not being given any economic independence, was not being encouraged to develop her mind in the directions that would have given her actual freedom in the world. She was being trained to be charming, and charm as a lifetime occupation for an intelligent person is a frustrating occupation, but the accomplishments also gave the women who acquired them real substantial pleasure and real substantial skill. The young woman at the piano in our drawing room tonight has been practicing, for the past 9 years, an instrument that she now plays well. She knows a substantial repertoire. She can sight-read with reasonable fluency. She can transpose a song to suit her own voice. She can improvise a simple accompaniment to a tune she has just heard. These are not nothing. These are the skills of a working musician. In fact, even if she will never be paid a shilling for them, and they bring her, when she is sitting at her piano, into a state of competent, absorbed attention that is one of the genuine satisfactions of her life. So when she takes her place at the pianoforte tonight after dinner and selects a piece and begins to play, what is happening in the room is not simply that someone is providing background entertainment. What is happening is that a person who has worked hard at a skill is now exercising it in front of the people she loves most, who know how hard she has worked at it, and who appreciate her skill in a way that no other audience in her life ever quite will. The piece she is playing tonight is, let us say, a slow movement from a Haydn sonata. The notes come out one at a time, gently, into the warm room. The fire has settled to a low red glow. The mistress is sitting in her chair near the fireplace, with her needlework in her lap, the small movements of her hands keeping time with the music. The master is in another chair, his book closed in his hand, listening. The younger daughter is on the sofa under the window, sitting up straight, paying attention, because she has been told to, and because she is beginning, herself, to understand that her sister is doing something difficult and beautiful. The candles on the music branches throw their light onto the daughter's face as she plays. The candles in the room behind her dim her into a soft outline against the keyboard. And the music, that slow Haydn movement, 10 minutes or so of music fills the room like a kind of warm air. It is not background music. It is the only music in the room, and the room is paying attention to it. When it ends, there is a moment of silence, and then the master says quietly, "Very nicely played, my dear," and the daughter smiles a small, slightly embarrassed smile and turns the page in her music book, and the next piece begins. And this kind of evening music making was, I think, one of the great achievements of Regency domestic life. It produced daily and weekly in households across the country a small accumulation of beauty that was not part of any concert, was not recorded, was not preserved in any way that subsequent history could recover. It happened in the room and was gone. The young woman who played that Haydn movement 212 years ago is unknown to us. The exact night, the exact piece, the exact tempo at which she played it are lost. But the practice of which it was a part, the practice of the family evening organized around the instrument and the player, was repeated in countless households throughout the Regency period and beyond, and it gave the people who took part in it something very real. After the music, sometimes alongside it, came another major entertainment of the Regency drawing room: the cards. If you walked into 100 Regency drawing rooms at, say, 9:30 on a winter evening in 1814, you would find a card game in progress in a substantial proportion of them. Cards were, in this period, perhaps the single most pervasive form of social entertainment in the polite classes. They cut across age. The grandmother and the granddaughter could play together. They cut across sex. Men and women played together routinely. They cut across rank. The duchess and the country gentleman's wife and the merchant's daughter all played the same games, with similar conventions, in their respective drawing rooms. The card games of the Regency household were several. The most common and the most respected was whist. Whist was the card game of the serious adult player, the game taken with focus, played for small stakes or for none at all, requiring concentration and memory and a kind of slow analytical pleasure that its devotees found deeply satisfying. The game of the period played with a standard deck of 52 cards by 4 players in 2 partnerships seated alternately around the card table, with one player from each pair facing the other across the table. A hand of whist began with the dealing of all 52 cards, 13 to each player. The last card dealt, which fell to the dealer, was turned face up on the table and indicated the trump suit for that hand. The player to the dealer's left led the first trick, and the play proceeded clockwise, with each subsequent player playing a card of the same suit if they had one, and otherwise either trumping or discarding. The trick was won by the highest card of the suit led, or by the highest trump if any were played. The winner of one trick led the next. After all 13 tricks had been played, the score was tallied, with the partnership that had taken more tricks winning the hand. Games were typically played to 5 or 10 or some other agreed-upon score. The pleasures of whist were several. There was the pleasure of partnership, of trying to read your partner's signals through the cards he or she played, of supporting their long suit when it became apparent, of finessing the high cards in your own hand to extract maximum value from them. There was the pleasure of card counting, of remembering which cards had already been played and using that information to calculate the probable distribution of the remaining cards in the unseen hands. There was the pleasure of the silent communication between partners, conducted entirely through the cards on the table, with no spoken word allowed during the actual play of the hand. And there was the pleasure of the slow accumulation of small successes. Whist was not a game of dramatic single moments, of one big winning play that took the whole pot. It was a game of grinding skill, of small advantages added up over many hands, of playing a slightly better game than the people across the table from you and watching, hand by hand, your score creep ahead of theirs. For people who liked thinking in a particular controlled mathematical way, whist was deeply absorbing. It could occupy a household for hours. There were other card games as well. Loo was a faster, livelier game, played by more people at once, with more noise and more laughter, and more small-stakes betting. 21, which is to say 21, was beginning to be played in domestic settings, having migrated in from the gambling houses. Casino was a game of capture and combination that was popular particularly with younger players. Commerce was a trading game, more frivolous than whist, often played as a way to pass time before some more serious game began. The card table itself was a piece of furniture worth describing. It was usually a folding table, kept against the wall when not in use, and brought out and set up in the middle of the room when a game was about to begin. The top, when unfolded, was covered in green baize, the soft woolen fabric that had been the standard card table surface for centuries and would continue to be so. The green baize did several things. It muffled the sound of the cards being played. It provided a non-slippery surface so the cards lay where they were placed. It was easy on the eye in candlelight. It was a calm, neutral background against which the coloured faces of the cards stood out clearly. A 4-player whist table would have a candle at each corner, sometimes mounted on candlesticks placed on the corners themselves, sometimes on small candle stands beside the table. The light fell on the cards from above, illuminating each player's hand as they held it. Around the table were 4 chairs drawn close. Beyond the table, the rest of the drawing room continued its other activities, the mistress at her needlework, the younger daughter still at the pianoforte, playing more quietly now, so as not to disturb the players, a guest reading a book in another chair near the fire. The card players were one of several activities going on simultaneously, and the card table did not dominate the room in the way that, say, a television would dominate a modern room. It was its own small zone of attention, with its own 4 participants, and the rest of the household carried on around it. Stakes were a question that varied considerably from household to household. In our household, on this November evening, the stakes are nominal, a few coins put down at the start of the game, won and lost in small amounts, with the total exchange across an evening being a matter of shillings rather than pounds. The card playing here is recreational. It is not, in any meaningful sense, gambling, but gambling was a real and serious feature of Regency life, and it would be misleading not to acknowledge it. In other households, particularly in fashionable circles, in clubs, in the upper reaches of the aristocracy, card-playing was conducted for stakes that could ruin a family in a single evening. The newspapers of the period regularly reported the losses and bankruptcies of young men who had gambled themselves into disaster at the great London clubs, where games of faro and hazard could swallow tens of thousands of pounds across a few hours of play. The contrast between the small domestic whist table in a quiet drawing room and the fevered gambling table at White's or Brooks's in St James's Street was as great as the contrast between a private dinner and a public banquet. For most of the families we are interested in tonight, however, card-playing was a domestic, gentle, intelligent recreation. It occupied the evening pleasantly. It exercised the mind. It produced, in the case of whist, a particular kind of intimacy between the partners across many hands of play. It was a way of being together for several hours that was companionable, mildly competitive, slightly absorbing, but ultimately not very high stakes in any sense. And in our drawing room tonight, the card game has now begun. The master of the house and one of the visitors are partnered against the mistress and the elder daughter. The first hand has been dealt, the trump card has been turned, the first trick has been led, and the candles burn steadily over the green baize, and the cards move around the table one at a time, slowly and quietly, with the players considering their plays and then making them. Across the room, the younger daughter has taken up a book. The fire has been built up by the housemaid who came in for that purpose. The clock on the mantelpiece reads 10 o'clock. This is the depth of the Regency evening. This is the moment when the household has settled most deeply into its own internal rhythm. The dinner is hours behind them. The bed is still some hours ahead of them, The business of the day is forgotten. The world outside is dark and quiet. Inside, in this single warm room on the first floor of a brick house in the middle of London, a family is doing exactly what families have done at this hour, in this kind of house, for the past century, and will continue to do for at least another century yet. They are reading, playing music, playing cards, sitting near a fire, paying attention to one another in small ways, letting the evening run out slowly toward its natural close. I want, before we go any further, to pause for a moment on what is being talked about in that room, because the conversation of the Regency drawing room was, in its own way, one of its principal entertainments, and the way that conversation worked deserves a little careful attention. The Regency family did not, as a general rule, have very much new information coming into their lives from outside. There was the daily newspaper, which was read and discussed. There was the post, which arrived twice a day in central London by 1814, and brought letters from family and friends in other parts of the country. There was the occasional visitor, who brought news from another household. There was for the master the gossip of his chambers and his coffee house, and for the mistress, the small news she gathered on her morning visits and at the milliner's. Beyond that, the household lived largely on the slow accumulation of its own observations and its own slow processing of the world. This meant that the conversation of the evening was often a careful and deliberate working over of small bits of news and small observations of social life. A letter from a cousin in the country was read aloud in full, then discussed. The contents of a parliamentary debate, as reported in the morning's paper, were considered and argued over. A piece of social gossip, the engagement of someone known to the family or the troubles of someone else, was passed around the room and turned in everyone's hands like a small, interesting object. The talk had time to develop. It was not interrupted by phones or doorbells, or the various small intrusions that modern conversation has to contend with. A subject could be picked up, set down, picked up again 2 hours later, when something new about it occurred to someone, and worked through with the kind of slow circling attention that only an evening with no other agenda can really provide. There were also the routine subjects of family talk, the progress of the children's education, the condition of the house, the small repairs needed, the larger improvements being considered, the price of butter, of meat, of coal, the state of the master's professional affairs, in whatever degree of detail was thought suitable for the family's hearing, the small triumphs and difficulties of the various members of the household and their friends, the plans for the next few days and weeks, the plans for the next season, when the family would, if it followed the pattern of many comfortable London households, leave town for some weeks in the country during the deadest part of the summer. The conversation of the Regency evening had also a quality of literary reference that is somewhat lost to us now. The educated middle classes of this period read a fairly common set of books, and they referred to those books constantly in their everyday conversation. A passage from Pope, a quotation from Shakespeare, a reference to a character in one of the popular novels of the day, would slip into the evening's talk with a frequency that the modern reader finds surprising. The family understood the references because they had all read the same things. The references gave the conversation a kind of resonance, a common literary background that everyone shared, and that made small jokes and small allusions land more deeply than they otherwise would. With the same literary common ground extended to Scripture. The Bible was, in this period, the single most read book in any educated household, and quotations from it appeared in conversation as a matter of course. A psalm, a parable, a phrase from St. Paul would be spoken into the evening with the easy familiarity of someone using language that everyone in the room had known since childhood. The religious frame of reference was simply assumed, in a way that almost no modern conversation can assume any common frame of reference at all. There was the conversation of memory, too. The family had a shared past, accumulated over years of living together, and the long evening was the natural time for that shared past to be brought into the light. "Do you remember when?" said the mistress, and the family did remember when, and the story was told again, with everyone contributing their own remembered detail, and the past came briefly into the room and then settled back where it belonged. The slow circulation of family memory in evening after evening of repetition was one of the ways that a Regency family knew itself as a family rather than as a collection of individuals who happened to live in the same house. What was not, on the whole, talked about in the polite drawing room of 1814 were certain subjects of which the conversation of the period was carefully kept clear. Money, in any direct vulgar sense, was avoided. The actual income of the household was not, in general, a subject for casual evening talk, particularly in the presence of guests. The intimate physical realities of the body, illness in any embarrassing form, the difficulties of childbirth, the failures of digestion, were referred to obliquely, if at all. Politics was sometimes argued vigorously, but in respectable households the argument was conducted within understood limits, and the strongest expressions of party feeling were generally reserved for the men's part of the dinner. There were, in a word, certain rooms of the conversational house that were, by mutual agreement, kept closed in the drawing-room evening. This restraint can be read negatively. It can be read as the genteel suppression of important realities, the polite refusal to engage with the difficulties of life, the limitation of the social conversation to acceptable trivia. There is some truth to this reading, but there is also another way to look at it. The restraint was a form of mutual care. The drawing room was meant to be, in a particular way, a space of relative ease. The exclusion of certain subjects was, in part, a way of making the evening a kind of refuge from those subjects. The household talked about what it could comfortably talk about, and reserved the harder talking for other places and other times. There is a wisdom in this, perhaps, that we have not entirely retained. The modern dinner table can sometimes be the site of every difficulty in the family's life, all dragged out at once, with no other space in the day or week designated as the place for those difficulties to be addressed. The Regency household, by reserving certain conversations to certain settings, may have given itself a degree of evening peace that the modern household has to work harder to construct. Beyond the verbal conversation, there was the conversation of attention. The Regency drawing room was a room in which people were paying attention to one another in small, steady ways throughout the evening. The mistress would notice that her elder daughter was tired and would suggest she read for a few minutes rather than play another piece. The master would notice that his guest's wineglass was empty and would refill it. The daughter would notice that her father's book had slipped to the floor while he dozed, and would pick it up and put it on the side table beside him. These small noticings, repeated dozens of times across an evening, were a form of communication that was largely silent, but that built, hour by hour and year by year, the texture of family life. Modern attention, fragmented as it is across multiple devices and multiple streams of input, has a harder time producing this kind of slow, steady noticing of the people one is sharing a room with. The Regency evening, by limiting the available stimuli to what was actually happening in the room, gave attention a smaller and more focused field to work in, and that focused attention was, I think, one of the unrecognized achievements of the period. People knew each other slightly better, in a slightly more detailed and observed way, because they had nowhere else for their attention to go. So when we look at the family in the drawing room tonight, with the master reading by the lamp and the mistress sewing and the daughter at the piano and the younger child curled up reading and the card game in progress at the corner table, we are looking at a kind of social ecosystem in which conversation, attention, and shared activity were all knitted together in a particular way. The room was not silent. It was a careful, slow, low-volume environment in which several things were happening at once, all of them visible to all the people in the room, all of them subject to the gentle attention of the others, all of them contributing to a single shared evening. This is, I think, the texture I would most want to capture if I were asked to describe what was specifically valuable about the Regency drawing room evening. Not any single activity, not the music in itself, not the cards in themselves, not the reading aloud in itself, but the way that all of those activities sat together in a single room with a single fire, under the soft attention of a small group of people who knew each other very well for several long, quiet hours. The clock has reached 10:30. The card hand has been finished, the pianoforte has been closed for the night. The reading aloud has finished its chapter. There is a brief, small pause in the room, the kind of pause that comes near the end of any long evening, when everyone in the room can sense that the natural shape of the night is starting to point toward bed. But before we go upstairs to bed with them, I want to take you somewhere we have not yet been, down the back stairs, through the door at the end of the hall, into the part of the house we have not yet seen, the basement, the kitchen, the servants' hall, below stairs, because the household we have been watching, in all its candlelit gentility, is not an isolated enterprise. It is supported every minute of every hour of the evening by the work of other people, people who have been visible to us only at the edges of the scenes we have been describing. The footman laying the dinner table, the housemaid bringing up the coal, the cook somewhere out of sight producing, by some kind of magic, the actual food and the actual hot water and the actual fuel that the upper floor evening requires. These people have their own evening in their own part of the house, and it is worth, before the night ends, going down to see what they are doing while we have been watching the family upstairs. The kitchen of a middle-class London townhouse in 1814 was located in the basement of the house, accessible from the family's part of the building by a narrow back stair that ran from the kitchen up to the ground floor, and from there up to all the other floors of the house. The back stair was the servants' road. They used it many times a day, going up with coal, with hot water, with meals, with messages, and coming down again with empty bowls, with dirty linen, with whatever needed to be returned to the lower floor for processing. To descend the back stair from the ground floor, even on a quiet November evening, was to enter a different world. The temperature was different. The kitchen was almost always hotter than the rest of the house, because the kitchen range was kept burning all day for cooking, and even after the dinner had gone up to the family, the range was still warm, and the room held its heat for hours. The smells were different: roasting meat, boiled vegetables, bread, coal smoke, soap, candle tallow, all the various odours of the working life of the house, layered together into a complex domestic atmosphere that the family upstairs almost never directly encountered. The light was different. Below stairs, the cheap tallow candles were used. The light was yellower, smokier, less abundant. The walls were whitewashed plaster rather than painted plaster, kept clean by constant scrubbing rather than by constant polish. The kitchen itself was the heart of the basement. It was a large room, with a stone-flagged floor, a long wooden work table running down the centre, dressers along the walls holding pots and pans and the everyday china, and the cooking range itself dominating one whole wall. The range was a coal-fired iron stove, with an open fire grate in the middle for roasting meat, ovens on either side for baking, and various hot plates and trivets for cooking pots. The whole installation was a relatively new kind of kitchen technology in this period, having replaced, over the previous several decades, the older arrangement of a large open hearth with separate brick ovens and various specialized fittings. The closed range was more efficient, used less fuel, and produced a more controllable cooking environment, but it was hot, and it required constant attention to keep the fire at the right temperature. By 10 o'clock at night, with the family's dinner long since served and cleared, the kitchen has settled into its quieter evening hours. The cook, a woman of perhaps 45 years, has finished the major work of the day. She is sitting at the kitchen table now, with a cup of tea in front of her, and her account book open beside it, going over the day's expenses. The day's tea, by the way, is not the tea the family drank upstairs. It is the second steeping of those leaves, brewed strong and dark in the kitchen pot, sweetened with brown sugar, drunk with milk. The leaves of the household tea, after the mistress had finished with them in the drawing room, were given to the cook as a kind of perquisite of her position. She would have used them for a second brewing for the kitchen staff, perhaps even a third brewing if she was being economical. The tea downstairs was a paler, weaker version of what they had drunk upstairs, but it was tea, and it was a reliable evening pleasure for the staff. There are several other people in the kitchen at this hour. The kitchen maid, a younger woman of perhaps 20, is at the deep stone sink in the scullery off the kitchen, washing the last of the dinner dishes by candlelight. She has been at this work since the first dishes came down from the dining room 2 hours ago, and she has another half hour or so to go before everything is washed, dried, and put away. The water in her sink has been hauled hot from the kitchen range. When the water cools, she tips it down the drain in the scullery floor and goes back for more. She will wash by the end of her workday tonight several dozen plates, a substantial number of cooking pots and pans, all the silver, all the glass, all the tea things, and any other domestic equipment that has been used in the day. The washing is done with hot water, soap that the housekeeper has issued from the locked cupboard, and a quantity of physical labour that we, with our dishwashers and our hot taps, have largely forgotten the existence of. In the servants' hall, which is the room next to the kitchen where the staff eat and sit when they are not actively working, 2 of the men servants are sitting at the table. The footman who served at dinner has changed out of his livery and is in his shirt sleeves and waistcoat. He is tired. He has been on his feet since 6 in the morning. He is reading a newspaper that he picked up in the hall earlier in the day, in those few minutes when no one needed him, and he could disappear briefly into the back of the house. The other man in the hall is the coachman, who has come in from the small mews behind the house where the family's carriage is kept and the family's horses are stabled. He has finished his work for the night. The horses are fed and bedded down. The carriage is cleaned and ready for tomorrow. He has come into the kitchen for his late supper and his cup of tea before going out again to his quarters above the stable for the night. Upstairs, in the body of the house, 2 of the housemaids are still working. One is in the dining room, finishing the last of the cleaning up there now that the family has retired upstairs. She is folding the table linen, putting away the silver under the housekeeper's eye, sweeping the floor, banking down the dining room fire so that it will go out safely overnight. The other housemaid is on the bedroom floor, going from room to room. She is making sure the bedroom fires are still burning low. She is filling the warming pans, which are flat metal pans on long handles with hot coals from the kitchen range, and running them under the sheets of each bed to take the chill off the linen before the family comes upstairs. The warming pans were one of the small mercies of pre-central heating life. They turned a freezing bed into a tolerable bed for the few minutes between the master or mistress climbing in and falling asleep. The housemaid would do this tonight for every bed in the house, working her way upstairs with the warmed pans, leaving each room ready for its occupant. The housekeeper, who is the senior female servant of the household and the one to whom the female staff report, is in her own small room on the basement floor, with her ledger open in front of her, going over the day's stores. She knows to the exact pound and ounce what has come into the house today, what has been used, and what is in the larder for tomorrow. She controls, more or less directly, the flow of household goods through the house. The locked storerooms are her domain. The keys are on her person at all hours. She is, in her quiet, undemonstrative way, one of the most powerful figures in the household, far more important to its actual functioning than any of the family members upstairs. Without her, nothing would arrive and nothing would be accounted for. Without her, the entire economic structure of the house would collapse within a week. Was dealt between them, these people, the cook, the kitchen maid, the housemaids, the footman, the coachman, the housekeeper, and one or two others I have not specifically named, sustain the entire physical existence of the family upstairs. They get up before the family and they go to bed after the family. They do at every hour of every day the work that makes the family's evening possible. The tea that the mistress poured at 4:30 was made with water that the kitchen maid had heated. The dinner that the family ate at 6 was made by the cook over the course of the previous 6 hours of work. The candles burning in the drawing room were brought in fresh from the locked candle cupboard by the housekeeper. The fires in the grates were laid and lit and tended by the housemaids. The chairs the family is sitting in were polished by hand this morning before the family came down. Every visible piece of the family's evening is the result of invisible labour performed by people whose names will not be recorded by history and whose individual lives will not be remembered. I want to say something about that because it sits at the centre of the Regency household, and because it sits, in a different form, at the centre of most middle-class life in any era. The servants of a Regency household were paid wages, certainly. They were also fed, and given a bed in the house, and given a small daily ration of beer or other drink, and given, in some cases, an allowance for clothes. The wages themselves, by modern standards, were small. A cook in a respectable middle-class household might earn £15 or £20 a year in cash. A housemaid might earn £6 or £8, a footman £10 or £12. The entire annual wage bill for a household with 5 live-in servants might amount to £70 or £80, which was less than the cost of a single fashionable carriage, and considerably less than the cost of a single season's worth of new clothes for the family. This was, in modern moral terms, a deeply unequal arrangement. The servants worked very long hours, were on call essentially at all times, and received in cash only a small fraction of what their labour was actually worth. In return they got the bed, the food, the security of a position in a respectable house, and, in the better households, a considerable degree of long-term loyalty and care from the family they served. Some servants stayed with the same family for decades, sometimes for life. Some were treated almost as members of the extended household. Some were genuinely loved and genuinely loved back, and the relationship between them and the family they served had, in those cases, a real human depth that does not fit into any simple modern condemnation of the system. Other servants were treated badly. Other households were not kind. Other masters were demanding, unreasonable, occasionally cruel. The system gave great power to the family, and very little protection to the servants, and the quality of the servants' life depended enormously on the personal character of the people they happened to be serving. Some were lucky, some were not. What I want you to take away from this section, though, is not a moral verdict on the Regency servant system one way or the other. It is a recognition that the candlelit evening upstairs, the elegant drawing room, and the carefully poured tea, and the quiet hand of whist, and the slow Haydn sonata, was made possible by another whole evening, downstairs. In the kitchen and the scullery and the servants' hall, that was not candlelit in the same way, was not elegant, was not slow or gentle or refined. It was tiring, repetitive, hot, smoky, and physically demanding. And it was carried out, every day, by people whose contribution to the world we are looking at tonight is almost invisible in the historical record, but is, in a real sense, what made the world possible. When we romanticize the Regency drawing room, as it is easy to do, we should also remember the Regency kitchen. The two are inseparable. The peace of one is bought by the labour of the other. And the peace and the labour were going on simultaneously in the same house, separated by a single flight of stairs that the family rarely descended and the servants rarely ascended, without good reason. There is one more figure I want to mention before we leave the basement and go back upstairs, because she is, in many of these households, a particular and important presence. The nurse. In a household with young children, which our household has, there was usually a dedicated nurse, The nurse was a woman, often slightly older than the housemaids, often unmarried or widowed, whose entire occupation was the care of the children. She lived in the nursery on the top floor of the house with them. She slept in their room. By 10 o'clock at night, the nurse has long since put the children to bed. The two younger children of the house, a boy of 4 and a girl of 2, have been asleep since 7. The older daughter, who is 12 and a half, has been allowed to stay up later in recent months, and was downstairs in the drawing room earlier this evening, before being sent up to bed an hour ago. The nurse is now in her own small room next to the nursery, with a single tallow candle burning, mending a torn sleeve on one of the children's clothes by hand. She will go to bed herself in another half hour or so. She'll be up again at 6 in the morning, when the youngest child wakes. The nurse is, in many ways, one of the most important figures in any individual child's life in this period. She spends more hours with the children in a typical day than the mother does. She is the one they cry to when they are hurt. She is the one who sings them to sleep. She is the one whose face is the closest, the most familiar, the most immediate in their early childhood. The mistress upstairs in the drawing room loves her children, certainly, and visits them certainly, but the actual physical and emotional labour of mothering them in the immediate hands-on way is largely delegated to a hired woman who lives in the attic. This arrangement has been criticised, like the larger servant system, in various ways. It has been said that it produced a particular kind of emotional distance between Regency parents and their children. There is some truth to this, perhaps, but there is also another way of looking at it, which is that it produced, in many households, a particular kind of triangular emotional structure in which the child loved the nurse intensely, in an everyday way, and loved the parents differently, more idealistically, in a way that the small daily contact never quite tarnished. The nurse was warm and present and ordinary. The mother was beautiful and rare and special. Many children in this era seem to have managed to love both in different ways, and the system, however unequal, did not necessarily produce the cold, distant family life that later commentators have sometimes assumed. In our household tonight, the children have been asleep for hours. The nurse is finishing her sewing by her single candle. The whole top floor of the house is quiet, and the family downstairs is approaching the end of their evening. The clock in the drawing room has reached 11. The card game has ended. The mistress and her partner have, by a small margin, beaten the master and his guest, and there has been a quiet round of laughter and the kind of mild teasing that happens at the end of any reasonably balanced game. The cards have been gathered. The card table has been folded back against the wall. The mistress has gone to the bell pull near the fireplace and pulled it once, which is the signal to the servants below that the family is preparing to retire. A footman appears at the drawing room door within a couple of minutes. He has come up to take down the tea things, to bank the fire, to extinguish the candles in the room one by one once the family has gone, and to make sure the room is left in good order for the morning. The mistress thanks him. He withdraws to wait until the family has actually left the room. The mistress now does something small but deliberate. She goes around the room and picks up the items that need to come upstairs with her or with her family. A book that her elder daughter has been reading, a piece of needlework that the mistress wants to take to her own room to work on tomorrow, a letter that the master has been drafting and has set aside. These small objects of the evening are gathered up. The room is being left, gradually, in its overnight state. The family then proceeds, in the way that Regency families typically did at the end of an evening, to the front hall on the ground floor. They go down the staircase together, in a small, slow procession with the candles in their hands and the staircase lit only by their own candles and by the faint glow of the hall lamp at the bottom of the stairs. In the hall, the chamberstick table waits. The chamberstick table, as we mentioned at the beginning of the evening, was a small side table near the foot of the staircase, on which a row of chambersticks was kept ready. There would be one for each member of the family and additional ones for any guests staying the night. Each chamberstick was a small, flat candle holder with a low handle, designed for the journey upstairs. There would be a snuffer beside the table and a tinder box with which the candles could be lit if any of them had gone out. The footman who has come down with the family lights each chamberstick from the candle in his own hand and presents one to each member of the family in turn. The master takes his, the mistress takes hers, the elder daughter takes hers. They thank him quietly. He bows, and now the family begins to go upstairs to bed. I want you to picture this carefully. The hall is dim. The staircase rises into greater dimness above. Each member of the family has their own small candle in their hand. They go up the stairs in a small line, the master first, the mistress next, the daughter following. The candles throw small moving circles of light onto the steps as they climb. The shadow of each person, vastly elongated, ripples up the wall of the staircase beside them. The portraits on the wall, almost invisible in the dim light, watch them go. At the first landing, the master pauses to allow the others to catch up. The mistress kisses her daughter on the cheek and says something quiet about the morning. They move on, up the next flight, to the bedroom floor. And here, at the door of each bedroom, the family separates. The elder daughter goes to her own room on one side of the corridor. The master and mistress go to theirs, which adjoins through a small dressing room. They wish each other good night. The doors close one by one. The candles disappear behind the doors. The corridor returns to dimness, lit only by a single oil lamp burning low at one end of it. This is the moment, I think, that sits at the deepest part of the Regency evening, the moment of going to bed. The moment when the day finally lets go. Let us follow the master and mistress into their bedroom for a moment, because the bedroom and its rituals deserve a careful look before we let them sleep. The bedroom is a substantial room, larger than a modern bedroom, perhaps 18 feet square, with a high ceiling and a single window covered by heavy curtains drawn against the night. The fire in the grate is burning low, a banked-down fire that has been kept going by the housemaid throughout the evening, so that the room is not cold when the family comes up. The bed dominates the room. The four-poster with curtains is one of the great pieces of pre-modern bedroom technology, and it is worth understanding what it actually did. The curtains, when drawn, kept the warmth of the body in. They blocked drafts. They created a smaller enclosed space that could be heated by body warmth alone, even in a room where the larger air temperature was, by morning, not much above freezing. They also, importantly, gave the sleeper a sense of enclosure and privacy, even when sharing a bed with a spouse, that no modern bed quite provides. To draw the curtains around oneself at the end of the day was to retreat into a small, dark, warm cell of fabric that was, in cold weather, the most comfortable place in the entire house. The bed itself was made up with linen sheets, woolen blankets, a feather mattress laid on a horsehair undermattress, and a heavy quilted bed cover or counterpane. The pillows were generous and feather-stuffed. The whole bed was deep and soft, and by the time the warming pan had been run through it, warm. There was a chamber pot under the bed, because indoor plumbing as we know it did not exist. The water closet, which would become standard in middle-class houses by the middle of the century, was still a rare and somewhat experimental fixture in 1814. Most households relied on chamber pots, which were emptied each morning by the housemaids. The pot was a piece of porcelain or earthenware, kept under the bed during the day, used at night, covered with a lid, and removed in the morning by the housemaid as part of her dawn rounds. There is no point being delicate about this. Every member of the household used a chamber pot, and the housemaid emptied it. It was simply how the night went. There was a washstand in the room, with a basin and a ewer of water for the morning's washing. The water was cold. It would be warmed in the morning by a smaller jug of hot water brought up by the housemaid when the master and mistress were ready to wash. The washstand was the closest thing the room had to a bathroom. The full bath, when it was taken, was usually taken once a week or so, with hot water hauled up from the kitchen and poured into a portable bathtub that was set up in front of the bedroom fire. Bathing was not a casual daily routine in this period. It was an undertaking. The master and mistress now begin the small choreography of going to bed. They have come into the room together, but they will undress separately. The mistress has a small dressing room off the main bedroom, which is her own private space. She goes into it now with her chamberstick and closes the door. Inside the dressing room, the lady's maid is waiting. She has been waiting for some minutes, having been notified by the bell that the mistress was on her way up. The lady's maid is one of the senior female servants of the household, and her job is to attend personally to the mistress, particularly in the matter of her clothes and her toilette. She helps the mistress out of her evening dress, which is a complicated garment with a number of fastenings that are difficult to manage alone. She unties the lacings. She removes the dress. She helps the mistress out of her stays, which are the structured undergarment that gives the dress its shape. She brushes the mistress's hair, which has been up all evening in an elaborate arrangement, and braids it for the night. She helps the mistress into her nightgown, which is a long linen garment with long sleeves and a high neck. She holds the candle while the mistress washes her face and hands. She turns down the bed. The whole sequence takes perhaps 15 or 20 minutes. The lady's maid is competent and quiet. She has done this many hundreds of times before. The mistress, by the end, is in her nightgown, with her hair in a single long braid, her face washed, her teeth cleaned with a small soft brush and a powder. She is ready for bed. She thanks the lady's maid, who curtsies and withdraws, taking the evening dress and the stays and the other discarded clothes with her to be brushed and put away. The master, meanwhile, has been undressing in the bedroom proper. He does not have a valet in this household. Not every middle-class household ran to a male equivalent of the lady's maid. He undresses himself, hanging his coat and waistcoat over a chair, removing his shirt, washing his face at the washstand, putting on his nightshirt and his nightcap. The nightcap, which to modern eyes looks faintly ridiculous, was an entirely practical garment in a house where the bedroom temperature dropped near freezing overnight, and a bald or thinly haired man could lose serious body heat through his head while sleeping. The two of them, master and mistress, are now in their night clothes. They climb into the bed together, into the warm sheets, and pull up the blankets. One of them, depending on the household custom, gets out for a moment to draw the bed curtains around them. Or perhaps the lady's maid has done this earlier as part of her preparation. Either way, the curtains close, and the two people inside the bed are now in a small, dark, warm space, enclosed by fabric, with the rest of the larger bedroom sliding away into outer darkness around them. The candles in the bedroom are blown out, one by one. The fire is banked down to its overnight ember. The room becomes dark. In the rest of the house, similar small ceremonies are happening. The elder daughter has been undressed by the lady's maid more briefly, and is now in her nightgown in her own bed. Her candle is still burning. She is reading a few pages of a novel before she sleeps. She will blow her candle out soon, and her room will go dark too. Below stairs, the kitchen has been set to rights. The cook has gone up to her own small room near the housekeeper's. The housemaids have finished their last circuits of the house. The footman has banked all the fires. The doors have been locked. The shutters have been closed. The hall lamp has been turned down low. By 11:30, the entire house, from the basement to the attic, is dark. There are only the embers of various fires here and there, glowing faintly behind the iron of their grates. There is the faint lingering smell of beeswax and tallow where the candles have been snuffed. There are, here and there, the small sleeping forms of human beings in their warm beds breathing slowly, the day finally over. Outside, in the street, the watch is calling. The night watchman, an elderly man with a lantern and a wooden rattle, walks the street at intervals through the night. Every hour he calls the time and the weather. 11 o'clock and a fine night, he calls, and his voice carries faintly through the closed shutters into the bedrooms of the sleeping family. The watchman is the last layer of the city's response to the night, the institution that, before the establishment of the Metropolitan Police in 1829, did what little watching and warning the streets received during the dark hours. He will continue his rounds until 5 in the morning, when he will be replaced by the early street sweepers and the milk women and the first carts coming in from the country with the day's supplies. The watcher's voice fades as he moves down the street. The house is quiet again. The fog presses softly against the windows. The fire embers tick and shift in the grates. The breathing of sleepers fills the bedrooms. I want to step out of the house for a moment, before we come to the close of our evening, and stand in the street with the watchman, because the city around the sleeping family is itself a part of the story that the Regency evening cannot really do without. The London of 1814 at midnight on a November evening was a particular kind of place. It was not the silent city we sometimes imagine when we think of pre-industrial urban nights. It was, in fact, never quite silent. There were always sounds. The hooves of a late carriage somewhere on a nearby street, the distant call of another watchman, the low rumble, almost below hearing, of the great river half a mile to the south, with its barges and its tides moving steadily through the dark, the chimes of a church clock, marking the quarter, somewhere on the next street over, answered a few moments later by another church clock, and another until the hour or the quarter had been announced by half a dozen different bells across the central districts of the city. The street lamps that had been lit by the lamplighter at dusk were still burning, though by midnight some of them had gone out, and others were guttering low. The lamplighter's job was to light them at sunset, and in many parishes, to come back in the early morning to extinguish those still burning. Between those two visits, the lamps did what they could against the dark. The new gas lamps on the principal streets gave a steadier, brighter light than the old oil lamps still in use in the side streets. London at night, in 1814, was a city in transition, with the pools of brighter gas light on Pall Mall, and the developing terraces of the West End, and the dimmer, yellower oil lamplight still presiding over the older streets. A pedestrian walking through the city at midnight could feel the difference under his feet as he moved from one regime of lighting to the other. The streets themselves were largely empty at this hour. There were a few late-night pedestrians, men returning from clubs or from late evenings at friends' houses, walking with an attendant or with a stout stick in hand because the city at night was not perfectly safe, and a respectable man did not walk alone in dim streets without some thought to his security. There were sedan chairs occasionally going past, with two chairmen carrying the chair between them at a brisk trot, conveying some lady or gentleman home from a late party. There were carriages, fewer than during the day but not absent, moving along the principal thoroughfares with their lanterns lit. The drivers of these carriages were, in their way, another sort of night profession, the men who took fares from people coming home in the small hours, and who knew the streets of the city better in the dark than most of its inhabitants did in the daylight. The watch as a system was the principal organised response to the urban night. Every parish in London maintained its own watch force, a body of men who patrolled the streets between specific hours of the evening and morning, and who were responsible for keeping order, calling the time, and reporting on anything unusual. The men of the watch were, by this point in the period, not quite the figures of comic disrepute they had sometimes been earlier in the 18th century. They had been gradually professionalised, particularly in the more prosperous parishes. They were paid a small wage. They had uniforms of a sort, and equipment, the lantern and the rattle, being the most distinctive items. They walked specific routes. They reported to a constable, but they were also, by any reasonable assessment, an inadequate police force for a city the size of London. There were too few of them. They were too lightly equipped. They were too elderly, in many cases, to be effective against any determined wrongdoing, The reform of London's policing, which would come in 1829 with Sir Robert Peel's Metropolitan Police Act, and the establishment of the Metropolitan Police, was a recognition that the watch system had outlived its capacity to do the work the city now required. In 1814, however, the watch was still the system. Every street had its watchman. Every hour was called. Every petty disturbance was in theory reported. And the city, in its imperfect way, made it through most nights without major incident. The watchman walking down the street outside our family's house tonight is a man of about 60. His name might be John, or William, or Thomas, the kind of name that left no trace in the historical record. He has been a watchman on this beat for several years. He knows the houses by their numbers and many of the families by sight. He knows which houses are likely to have late visitors and which are usually quiet by 10. He knows which front doors stick in damp weather. He knows which areas, the basement courts in front of the houses, have steps that are slippery when wet. He has, in his own slow nightly way, been a kind of intimate companion to the street for years, even though almost no one on the street has ever spoken to him for more than a moment in passing. He carries a lantern with a small candle inside, which throws a small circle of light at his feet. He carries a wooden rattle, which is his alarm in the case of disturbance, and which produces, when shaken, a loud clattering noise that can be heard for some distance. He carries a stout stick, both as a tool and as a defensive weapon. He wears a heavy greatcoat against the cold, and a broad hat to keep the rain off his face. His feet, in solid leather boots, are slow but reliable. His round takes him along the street and back, then around the corner into the next street, and back again, and so on, in a long looping pattern that covers his whole beat in about an hour. At intervals he stops and calls. The hour, the half hour, the quarter hour, the state of the weather, fine night, foggy night, raining hard. Sometimes a small additional comment. All is well, all quiet. The calls are partly informational, telling the residents who happen to be awake what time it is, and partly reassuring, simply marking that the watch is on duty, and that the streets have not been abandoned to whoever might be in them otherwise. Inside the houses, the watch's voice is part of the night's furniture. People hear it without quite hearing it. They register, in their half-sleep, that the calls have happened, and they go on sleeping. A child might wake briefly, listen, and roll over. A servant, making her last round of the kitchen at midnight, might pause to listen, hear the call of the hour, and then continue her work. The mistress, lying behind the curtains of her four-poster, might surface for a moment from sleep, hear the watchman's voice fading down the street, and feel obscurely comforted before she sinks back into her dreams. That comfort, the comfort of the watchman's call, is one of the small features of the Regency night that has not really been replaced by anything in our own time. We have, in the modern city, far more effective security than the night watch ever provided. We have police forces, alarm systems, electric lighting, locked doors of vastly greater strength than the locks of 1814. We are, by any objective measure, much safer in our beds than our Regency ancestors were. But we do not in general have the experience of a single human voice calling out at intervals through the night to tell us that someone is awake and watching while we sleep. The hourly call of the watchman, faintly heard from inside the warm bed, was a kind of audible blanket. It said, "You are not alone. Someone is keeping watch. Sleep on." I think about that small absence in our own nights. The presence of voices outside has been replaced, in our world, with various other forms of company. The hum of distant traffic, the occasional siren, the indistinct murmur of a city that never properly stops. But the deliberate addressed, named voice of a single man calling the time to sleeping families, that is gone. And there is a small loss in its going that, like many of the small losses in the historical record, is not really mourned because hardly anyone now remembers what was there before. Beyond the watchman, the city around our sleeping family was, at midnight in November 1814, full of other lives that the family inside the house knew very little about. There were, in the same square mile of London, 1,000 other households going through their own version of the same evening. There were taverns and chop houses still serving their last customers. There were brothels in the less reputable streets, conducting their nightly business in the dim. There were the great markets, Smithfield and Covent Garden and Billingsgate, which, while not at their peak hours, were already beginning to stir with the first carts coming in for the morning's trade. There were watchmen on every street, like ours, calling their hours. There were lampmen still tending lamps that had gone out, in some parishes that paid them to make a midnight round. There were the river barges moving on the Thames, which never quite slept, with their cargo of coal and timber and goods of every kind being moved up and down the river in the slow, steady tidal rhythm. There were the East India docks far down the river, where the great ships of the East India Company unloaded their cargoes of tea, of silk, of spices, of all the products that filled the houses of the comfortable middle classes. The ships moored there at midnight, with their watchmen on board, their lanterns hanging from the rigging. There were prisons holding their populations through the dark hours. Newgate, the great prison at the Old Bailey, with its inmates awaiting trial or transportation or, in some cases, execution. The various smaller prisons across the city, the Fleet, the King's Bench, the Marshalsea, holding debtors who could not pay their debts and who lived inside those institutions for years, sometimes in conditions that the comfortable classes a few streets away rarely thought about. The hospitals, St. Bartholomew's and St. Thomas's and the Foundling, with their patients and their few sleeping nurses, and the occasional surgeon on duty for emergencies, than were the great houses of the very rich in Mayfair and St. James's, with their parties still continuing in some cases until 2 or 3 in the morning, the windows blazing with candles, the dance music still playing, the carriages waiting in long lines outside the door for guests who had not yet decided to leave. There were the smaller respectable houses like ours, in their thousands, dark and quiet by midnight, with their families asleep and their fires banked. There were the workhouses, with their inmates in their dormitories. There were the slums of St. Giles and the Docklands, with their crowded courts and their thin partitions, where families slept in single rooms with whatever warmth they could manage and whatever food they had been able to buy that day. There were the homeless, sleeping in doorways and under bridges, in numbers that the more comfortable parts of the city found easy to ignore, but that were a constant presence in the streets where they accumulated. All of this whole vast and varied nightlife of 1,000,000 people, was happening simultaneously in the city around our family's sleeping house. The Regency middle-class evening, in its candle-lit gentility, was one small bubble of experience floating in a much larger sea of human existence, much of which was harder, less comfortable, and considerably less amenable to romanticization. It is worth, I think, holding both pictures in mind at once: the drawing room with its pianoforte and its argand lamp, and the courtyard a few streets away, where a family of 5 is sleeping on straw under a single thin blanket. The two existed at the same time in the same city, and both are part of what 1814 actually was. I do not raise this to undercut the picture of the comfortable evening we have been building. The comfortable evening was real, and the people who lived through it were real, and their experience of the world was as legitimate as anyone's. But the comfortable evening also did not happen in a vacuum. The peace and the warmth and the leisure of the family in the drawing room were made possible in part by an entire economic structure that produced at the same time the discomfort and cold and labour of many other lives, both within the household, in the persons of the servants below stairs, and outside the household in the wider city, where most people did not live in townhouses, and did not have pianofortes, and did not pour tea from silver pots in candlelit drawing room. The Regency evening, in the form we have been describing, was a privileged form of evening. It was, by the measure of its own time, the evening of perhaps the top 15 or 20% of London's population. The other 80 or 85% had evenings of various other shapes, mostly less comfortable, sometimes considerably less so. To remember, this is not to spoil the picture, but to set it in its proper frame, which, like any good frame, holds the picture in place by acknowledging what surrounds it. The watchman calls the half hour after midnight as he turns the corner at the end of the street, 12:30 and a foggy night. His voice is muffled by the fog and reaches the bedrooms of our family only as a soft, indistinct sound, a small auditory marker of the passing of the night that they hear without registering. The fog itself is thickening as the hours go on, the way it often did in November London. By morning, the fog will be sufficiently dense that the lamplighter, when he comes round to extinguish the lamps, will find his work confused and the streets nearly blind. By the time the master of the house leaves for his chambers at 9, the fog will have begun to lift, but the day will be a dim one, with the sun barely visible behind the layered atmosphere of fog and coal smoke that characterizes a London winter morning. But all of that is hours away, for now the city is in its deep night. Our house is dark, the watchman is moving on, the river is moving on, the barges are moving on, the fog is settling on the windows and the streets, and inside the house the family is sleeping, in beds warmed earlier by the housemaid's pan, behind the curtains of their four-poster, or in narrower beds in narrower rooms upstairs, with the housemaids and the cook, the other servants, in their own narrower beds-attic rooms. Everyone, from the master in the principal bedroom to the youngest child in the nursery to the kitchen maid in her tiny attic room behind the housekeeper's, is asleep. The whole house, considered as a single organism, is asleep. Every room is dark. Every fire is banked. Every candle is out. The house, which has been a small ecosystem of light and conversation and music and food for the last 6 hours of the evening, has fallen into its own deep version of the night, in which nothing happens for several hours except the slow combustion of the banked fires and the slow breathing of the sleepers and the slow turning of the hours toward the next morning. And outside, the watchman's voice has receded down the street, faint and fainter, until it is gone, and the city closes over the small island of the sleeping house, and the night continues without further marking, except for the occasional distant chime of a church clock somewhere, until at last the first early carts begin to roll into the city from the country at 4 or 5 in the morning, and the cycle of another London day begins again. This is the deep part of the night. This is what the Regency evening was, in the end, a long, careful preparation for. Not for productivity, not for entertainment, for sleep, for the simple animal pleasure of being warm in a soft bed, in a quiet house, with the people you loved sleeping nearby, and with the night safely outside the shutters. Sleep itself, in the Regency household, was a slightly different thing from the sleep we know. It was, on average, a longer sleep. The household that had gone to bed at 11:30 would not, in most cases, rise before 7 or 8 in the morning. That gave the master and mistress something between 7 and 8.5 hours in bed, which is broadly comparable to what we now consider a healthy adult sleep. But it was a sleep in a colder room, in a darker house, with no electronic light leaking into the bedroom from anywhere, and with the kind of unbroken silence around it that the modern bedroom in any city almost never gets. There is some evidence, gathered by historians of sleep over the last few decades, that pre-industrial European sleep was sometimes broken into 2 distinct segments, what they have called the first sleep and the second sleep, with a wakeful interval of perhaps an hour in the middle of the night, during which the household member would lie awake, sometimes pray, sometimes have quiet conversation with a bedmate, sometimes simply think, before drifting back into the second sleep that took them through to morning. By the early 19th century, this 2-part sleep pattern was beginning to fade, particularly in the cities where the lengthening of the evening, with its better lighting and its later activities, was compressing the night into a single block of sleep, more like the one we now consider standard. But traces of the older pattern survived, and there were still adults in 1814, particularly older ones, who experienced the night as two sleeps with an interval between them, and who used that interval for their own quiet purposes. I find the idea of the two-part sleep, or the segmented sleep, genuinely worth thinking about. The middle-of-the-night wakefulness that, for us, often feels like a problem, an unwelcome interruption of the rest we are supposedly entitled to, may have been, for our ancestors, simply a normal phase of the night with its own kind of value. To wake at 3 in the morning and lie quietly in the dark, listening to the breathing of one's spouse, watching the embers of the fire across the room, thinking one's own thoughts in a state that was neither asleep nor properly awake, was perhaps one of the small contemplative gifts of the older night, not something to be fought against, but something to be received. In our household tonight, all of these reflections are, for the moment, beside the point. The family is sleeping their first sleep, the deep sleep of the early hours of the night, the sleep that comes after a long evening of activity and a warm bed and a clear mind. They will sleep this way, in this depth, for several hours yet, before any of them stirs. The youngest child will be the first to wake around 6 in the morning, calling out for the nurse. The housemaids will be up before that, of course, lighting the kitchen range, sweeping the front steps, beginning the next round of the household's tireless work. But for the family upstairs, the night is, for the moment, complete and uninterrupted. I have, throughout this episode, tried to bring you into the rooms of a particular kind of household on evening, and to show you the small textures of how that evening worked. The tea, the dinner, the withdrawal, the reading, the music, the cards, the servants below stairs, the chambersticks, the 4-poster bed, the watchman's voice fading down the street. I want to close with a few thoughts about what the whole of this evening meant, and what, if anything, it can still mean for us, 212 years later. The Regency middle-class evening was, fundamentally, an evening of presence. The family stayed in the same house. They moved through a sequence of shared rooms, doing shared activities, in continuous low-stakes contact with one another. The dinner brought them around the same table. The withdrawal separated them briefly, but only into 2 groups in 2 rooms still under the same roof. The drawing room reunited them. The reading aloud, the music, the card playing, all kept them together in the same space, attending to the same things hour after hour, with the slow background presence of the fire and the candles to mark the passage of time. This continuous shared presence is the thing I keep coming back to. It was not always interesting. It was not always dramatic. There were tensions in this household, certainly. There were quiet resentments and unspoken disappointments, and the small irritations that any family produces when its members are forced into one another's company, night after night. The Regency household was not a paradise of domestic happiness. It was simply a structure within which family life was lived, but that structure had certain qualities that, looking back at it from our own period, I think are worth noticing. The household took its evenings slowly. It was prepared to spend many hours together without any particular agenda. It valued the small daily skills of its members, the daughter's piano playing, the master's reading aloud, the mistress's pouring of tea, in a way that gave each of them a small daily occasion to be appreciated by the people who knew them best. It accepted that the entertainment of the evening would be made by the household itself, from its own resources, using its own bodies and its own voices and its own hands. It did not import its entertainment from outside. The entertainment was internal, generated, immediate, performed live in the room. This is, I think, what is most absent in our modern domestic evenings, and what is most worth thinking about. The entertainment in our households tonight, in 2026, comes overwhelmingly from outside. It is produced elsewhere, transmitted to us through screens, and consumed by each of us, often individually, often simultaneously but separately, often in different rooms or in the same room while looking at different devices. The production of our evenings has been outsourced in a way that the Regency family would have found difficult to imagine. We do not mostly make our own music. We do not mostly read aloud to one another. We do not mostly sit and play long card games together. We do not mostly do the small handwork that gives one's hands something to do while one's ears are occupied by something else. We have, of course, gained enormous things by the trade. The entertainment available to us is vastly richer, vastly more varied, vastly more skilled than anything any single household could produce. The piano in the drawing room, beautiful as the daughter's playing was a single instrument played by a single amateur. We can listen, tonight, in our own homes to the great pianists of the world playing the great music of the world, recorded and transmitted to us at the touch of a button. We can watch films and shows and games and educational lectures and any number of other things that the Regency household had no access to whatsoever. The individual richness of our evening, considered as a stream of content, is incalculably greater than theirs. And yet, there is something the Regency evening had that we do not have, and that I think is worth naming carefully. It had the quality of being made by the people in the room. It was a small artifact produced every night by the family itself. The piano playing was theirs, the reading aloud was theirs, the card game was theirs, the tea pouring was theirs. Whatever its quality, whatever its limitations, whatever its imperfections, the evening was the work of the people who lived through it, and it was theirs in a way that consumed entertainment can never quite be ours. I am not going to argue that the Regency evening was better than the modern evening. That is not the kind of comparison that history sustains, and there is no point pretending otherwise. It belonged to its own period, with its own conditions and its own constraints, and many of those conditions are not ones we would choose to return to, even if we could. The cold bedrooms, the chamber pots, the unequal labour of the servants, the strict separation of the sexes after dinner, the narrow range of acceptable activities and the corresponding selves. None of these are things we ought to romanticize. What I want to suggest is something smaller and more particular than a wholesale return to the past. It is just the recognition that there were, in that older world, certain qualities of attention and presence and slow shared time that have, in our own period, become harder to find, and that it is worth occasionally sitting with the older form of evening in our imagination, just to remind ourselves that it was once possible, and that some version of it might still be available to us, if we cared to seek it out. The reading aloud, for instance, is not gone. There are families that still read aloud to each other in the evenings, though they are fewer than they once were. There are book groups that meet to share readings. There are audiobook listening sessions in which a group can listen together to the same recording. The form has changed, but the underlying activity, the gathering around language being given out by one voice, is recoverable. The card playing is not gone. There are families that still play cards in the evenings, though again they are fewer. There are board game evenings. There are tabletop role-playing groups. The instinct to gather around a small flat surface and play a game with the people one lives with is one of the most resilient human social patterns, and it survives in many forms. The music is not gone. The amateur tradition of domestic music making has receded enormously since the Regency, but it has not disappeared. There are families with pianos that still get played. There are family sing-alongs at Christmas. There are children learning instruments and being asked to play for visiting relatives. The pianoforte tradition is dimmer than it was, but its embers are still there. If we look for them, the tea is not gone. The afternoon tea ritual, in some form, survives in many households as a small daily occasion of sociability. The locked caddy has gone, certainly. The expensive leaves have gone, but the kettle and the cups and the small interruption of the day for a drink and a conversation are still with us. Hort and the slow evening together, the unhurried hours by the fire with the people one loves, is not gone either, though it has become harder to protect against the encroachments of work and screens and the various modern demands on attention. It is still possible, on a winter night, to put away the phones, to dim the lights, to make a fire, to sit in a room with one's family, and to do something together for several hours that is generated by the room itself rather than transmitted into it. It can be hard to do. When I think about what the Regency evening offers us, I think it offers us a kind of imaginative permission. Permission to be slower than we usually allow ourselves to be. Permission to be present with the people in front of us without needing the moment to be entertaining or productive in any particular external way. Permission to value small skills, the daughter's piano playing, the master's reading aloud, the mistress's tea pouring, as the daily artifacts of a life made of small skills accumulated and exercised. Permission, in other words, to make our own evenings rather than buying them ready-made. That permission, I think, is worth taking every now and then, even if only as a one-night experiment, and the Regency household, in all its small particular ways, can serve as a kind of imaginative model for what such an evening might feel like. Let me close where I began. It is late now in our story. The clock in the hall of the house is striking midnight. The whole household is asleep. The fires are embers. The candles are out. The watchman is somewhere down the street, halfway through his round. The fog is thick at the windows. The city outside is as quiet as it ever gets, which is not perfectly quiet, because London is never perfectly quiet, but is quiet enough that, inside the house, the only audible sounds are the occasional shift of a coal in a grate and the soft regular breathing of sleeping people. Somewhere in the darkness of the house, the elder daughter, in her bed, dreams of the Haydn sonata she played tonight, hears a fragment of it in her sleep, smiles slightly without waking. Somewhere in another bed, mistress turns slightly in her sleep, and the master breathes evenly beside her behind the drawn curtains of the four-poster. In the attic, the nurse sleeps in the small bed in the children's room with the youngest child's small breathing nearby, easy to listen for in the dark. In the basement, the housekeeper, who has been awake longer than any of them, finally lies down and lets the day go. Tomorrow, it will all begin again. The fires will be relit before dawn by the housemaids, who will have been up since 5. The kitchen range will be raked out and built up. The master will rise at 7 and breakfast at 7:30 and leave for his chambers by 9. The mistress will rise at 8, take her chocolate in bed, dress with her maid's help, and come downstairs to begin her own day of letters and visits and the management of the household. The children will wake and be fed and be taught and be taken out for their walk in the small park at the end of the street. The day will repeat itself with small variations and end again, at last, in another candlelit evening in the same drawing room. And so it will go, evening after evening, for years, for the rest of the period we are calling the Regency, for the rest of these people's lives, until the lives end and the children become the parents in their own houses, and the cycle continues. The names will be lost, but the shape of the evening will remain in the historical record, because the shape was repeated so many times, in so many houses, by so many people, that it has come down to us as a pattern, even when the individual examples have not. We can reconstruct the rooms, we can reconstruct the rituals, we can imagine the candlelight, we can listen, in our minds, to the slow Haydn sonata played by a daughter we will never know, in a drawing room we will never enter, on a November evening 212 years ago. That is what we have done tonight. Imagined it. Carefully, slowly, with as much detail as I have been able to find, and as much care as I have been able to bring to the finding of it. I want to say one last thing before I let you go. The Regency evening was, in many ways an evening at the end of an older world. Within a generation of the night we have been visiting, the railways would arrive and the speed of British life would change forever. Within 2 generations, gas lighting would have spread into every middle-class home, and the whole quality of the evening interior would have shifted from the warm gold of candle and oil to the harder, whiter light of the gas mantle. Within 3 generations, electric light would arrive, and the small island of light around the candle would have given way to the evenly lit room we now consider the natural condition of an indoor space. Within 4 generations, the recorded voice and the recorded image would begin to enter the home, and entertainment would begin its long migration from being something the household made for itself to being something it received from outside. Within 5 generations, all the small structures we have been describing, the formal dinner, the withdrawal, the reading aloud, the family pianoforte, the locked tea caddy, the chamberstick on its table at the foot of the stairs, would have receded almost entirely from middle-class life, surviving only in costume drama and historical novels and the imaginations of those who, like us tonight, occasionally take the time to look at them carefully. That is a great deal of change in a relatively short stretch of time. The world in which our family was sleeping tonight, in 1814, was about to enter the most dramatic period of transformation that any country had ever undergone. The Industrial Revolution was already underway in the northern factories, but its full effect on the domestic life of the South was still some decades off. The peace after Waterloo, which was less than a year away on this November night, would unleash energies that had been held back by 20 years of war. The railways, the steam, the gas, the electric, the telegraph, the photograph, the phonograph, the cinema, the wireless, the television, the internet, the phone in your pocket, all of it lay ahead, and all of it would, in its own way, alter the shape of the domestic evening that we have spent these hours together looking at. The family asleep in our house tonight knows none of this. They will live their whole lives in something close to the world we have been describing, with small modifications. The mistress, if she lives a normal lifespan, will see the first railways open. The master will see gas lighting come into his neighbourhood. The elder daughter, if she has a long life, may live to see Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, by which time the evening of her childhood will already feel impossibly distant to her own grandchildren. The youngest child in the nursery upstairs may, if she lives long enough, experience the very early years of the 20th century. But none of them will live to see the world we now live in, and our world would be to them more strange than any country they could have visited in their own lifetimes. This is one of the things history quietly teaches, if we let it. Every present moment, including this one, will eventually look as quaint and as distant to some future observer as the Regency evening looks to us. The phones we hold in our hands, the screens we watch in the evening, the patterns of our own daily lives will become, in time, the subject of their own slow, nostalgic contemplation by people who have moved on into ways of living that we cannot now imagine. There is no fixed point. There is only the long succession of evenings, each one feeling at the time like the natural way to spend a night, each one in fact being only one form among many that human evenings have taken across the long history of human dwelling. What I find in spending an evening like the one we have just spent in imagination is a kind of small consolation in this. The evenings of the past, the ones we have lost, were not lost without anything taking their place. The evenings of the future, the ones we cannot now picture, will not happen in a vacuum either. There has always been an evening. There has always been a household in some form, with its own small rituals of the day's ending. There has always been someone somewhere going to bed at the close of the day with the people they have come to love, in a room known by some kind of light they have come to expect. The form changes. The substance, the simple human business of arriving safely at the end of another day, remains. Thank you for travelling this evening with me. Thank you for being still while I described it. for letting your mind enter rooms that no longer exist and listen to people who can no longer be heard. The evening we built together tonight, in your imagination as you listened, was a small private thing made out of attention and language and whatever pictures your own mind was willing to provide. In its way, it was not unlike the evenings we have been describing. Small, self-made, generated in the room, belonging to whoever was there. If you have stayed with me to the end, you are exactly the kind of listener this kind of episode is for. I am grateful for your time. There is another evening coming, in another period of the past, and I hope you will join me for it when it does. We will go somewhere new. We will sit by a different fire. We will look at a different small slice of vanished domestic life, and we will, again, take our time with it. But for tonight, that is enough. The candles in our Regency house are out. The family is asleep. The watchman has called the half hour after midnight, and his voice has faded down the street, and the fog has closed over the city, and there is nothing more to see in this particular house, on this particular night, in this particular long ago year. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one.